A grand ornate building stands tall under a cloudy sky, with petals drifting softly through the air. Inside the grand halls, a mystical ceremony begins. A brilliant orb of light pulses with power above an ornate pedestal, while hooded figures look on in solemn silence. The ceremony continues, as the divine voice announces the result for one of the participants. Your suitable profession is soldier. With the result declared, the call for the next person follows. The call for the next person rings out. Standing beside Chris, a girl reacts with excitement, shouting yes, as she awaits her turn. As the ceremony proceeds, the focus shifts to Chris sparring. The crowd whispers in anticipation, recognizing him as the son of the famous sparring family, and wondering what powerful profession he will be granted by the ritual of heavenly grace. In the kingdom of Meldrake, every 16-year-old must undergo a ritual to reveal their suitable profession and the skills that come with it. These roles vary widely, from combat-oriented jobs like warriors and knights to non-combat roles such as merchants and farmers. While those who obtain high-class professions receive preferential treatment from the state, making this the most pivotal moment of their lives, there is also a grim opposite for those who do not. Chris reflects on his upbringing, remembering the intense training he endured to meet his father's high expectations as the future head of the family. He knows that anything less than a prestigious profession would be a disgrace. The official calls for the next person. Chris answers and steps forward, his name echoing through the hall. The moment of truth arrives. As the ritual processes his identity, the announcement begins, leaving Chris in tense anticipation as his future career is about to be revealed. The moment of truth arrives, but the result is devastating. Instead of a prestigious combat class befitting his lineage, the ritual declares Chris' profession as a farmer, granting him only the skill of poison resistance. Chris stands paralyzed as the weight of the result sinks in. Around him, the other participants are left bewildered, whispering in confusion. Suddenly, a voice erupts in total disbelief, shouting the unthinkable truth. Chris is to be a farmer. While Chris remains in shock, a boy named Klaus steps forward to offer words of encouragement, telling him to cheer up despite the shame of his result. However, Klaus' fake smile reveals his true condescending nature. As the crowd admires Klaus for being so gentle, the ritual continues with the next person being called forward. Klaus continues to play the part of the caring friend, commenting on how worried Chris must be about his profession, maintaining his image in front of the observers. Breathless and devastated, Chris is haunted by memories of his relentless training. He recalls the sweat and effort he poured into becoming a powerful successor, only to be left wondering what it was all for. While Chris sinks into despair, the atmosphere in the hall shifts instantly. The crowd gasps in awe as another youth is granted the prestigious Holy Sword class, a rare honor that has only appeared 5 times since the era of the first hero. Milo stands confidently, a smug smile on his face as he basks in the glory of receiving the legendary Holy Sword class. The crowd looks on in awe, further highlighting the cruel contrast between his success and Chris' failure. While others celebrate the legendary classes, Klaus is basked in the pride of his father. The man praises him for living up to the family name, urging him to become a great leader in the future. In stark contrast to the praise given to Klaus, Leon's expression turns to one of pure fury and disappointment as he glares at Chris. Chris can only stare back, paralyzed by the overwhelming intensity of his father's hatred. Leon screams in fury, reminding Chris of the years he spent teaching and caring for him, only for Chris to end up as a mere farmer. Despite Chris' quiet apology, Leon is enraged by his son's emotionless expression and commands him to get out of his house. Leon's voice echoes one last time, calling him a useless thing as Chris walks away from the grand mansion. Recalling the previous day's misery, Chris remembers being forced to fight with bare hands as a mere target for sparring practice. Now, stripped of his status and home, he carries only a small bag of belongings into an uncertain future. Just as Chris turns to leave the family estate for good, he is stopped by his younger brother. The boy looks at him with a conflicted expression, asking if he truly intends to depart without saying a single word. Aiden watches Chris walk away, his expression solemn. He calls out to his brother, telling him that he had saved the family's reputation for him. But the current situation has changed everything. Aiden wears a smug, arrogant look as he looks down on his brother. He asks with a sneer if Chris doesn't even have a simple thank you for him. Aiden asks Chris why he is making fun of him, pointing out that they have never actually spoken to each other before. Meanwhile, a narrative reveals that since childhood, Klaus was very weak and required the constant care of his mother and a doctor, though he gradually recovered by the age of 5. While Aiden was subjected to rigorous training by their father, Klaus' experience was entirely different. As a frail child, he was sheltered and pampered, spending his days in the comforting embrace of his mother, completely spared from the grueling discipline others had to endure. Aiden reflects on his past, remembering how he tried to talk to Klaus, only to be met with silence and indifference. Despite his efforts, they never had a proper conversation, a realization that now only brings a cold, mocking laugh to Aiden's lips. Returning to the present, Aiden laughs mockingly, pointing to his head as he asks Chris why he still doesn't understand. Chris looks on with a bewildered expression, eventually clicking his tongue in annoyance. Aiden's expression becomes manic as he vents his long-held bitterness, declaring that he was the one abandoned by their father. Long before today, he scoffs at Chris, questioning how someone who was raised with care could ever understand his pain, simply because Chris was born 10 minutes before him. Aiden continues to dwell on the past, wondering why Klaus harbors such hatred toward him. He realizes that Klaus, despite his frail health, had his own thoughts and feelings that were perhaps overlooked. Aiden lets out a hollow laugh as he remembers the past. While Klaus was cherished and comforted by Lyra, Aiden stood alone in the shadows, feeling isolated. He admits to himself that, of all of them, he was the one who wanted things to change the most. Aiden gloats, claiming that God was on his side and bestowed upon him the power of the Holy Sword. With a cruel smile, he turns the focus to Chris, shouting the word farmer, to mock his failure. Pushed to his limit, Chris screams for him to shut up, his face twisted in rage. In a sudden and threatening move, Aiden points the tip of his sword directly at Chris' forehead, asserting his superiority with the weapon of the Holy Sword class. Aiden wears a cruel, malicious smile as he keeps the sword pointed menacingly. He coldly warns Chris not to get angry, mockingly asking if he wishes to be killed right here. Aiden lets out a cold sigh, his eyes filled with contempt as he continues to mock Chris' status. Aiden lets out a mocking laugh, openly ridiculing Chris for being nothing more than a lowly farmer. He sneers, questioning if Chris truly has the audacity to fight against the power of the Holy Sword. With a smug smile, Aiden tells him that he's ready to fight whenever he is. Aiden lets out a mocking laugh, completely underestimating his opponent. But beneath the shadow, Chris' eyes flare with a cold, intense determination. Despite being labeled as a mere farmer, Chris recalls the years of grueling training he endured since childhood, convinced that the outcome of this clash is already decided. Aiden suddenly strikes with intensity, shouting that it hasn't ended yet. Chris is caught off guard by the sudden burst of aggression. Aiden looks on with complete indifference, his gaze cold and mocking. He declares that it's settled, coldly stating that he has no interest in the weak. Aiden stands distant and indifferent, leaving Chris frozen in the wake of the attack. However, as the humiliation sinks in, Chris' gaze sharpens with a newfound hatred, and a dark, silent vow echoes in his mind. I will kill you. With a cold command for him to die, Aiden unleashes the devastating sacred slash, sending Chris flying backward as the powerful strike tears through the air. The devastating impact of the sacred slash leaves a crater of rubble. Aiden clicks his tongue in irritation, but amidst the debris, Chris remains unscathed. Realizing that the attack actually missed him, Aiden pants heavily, realizing he used too much strength in his strike. Meanwhile, Chris looks on with wide, shocked eyes, unable to believe the situation. Aiden stands with a confident, smug smile, embodying the prestige of his class. Chris looks on, overwhelmed by the realization of the staggering power difference between them. Unable to make sense of the gap, the impact of the attack ravages the landscape, snapping trees and tearing up the ground in a violent explosion. Amidst the chaos and debris, Chris curses in frustration, completely overwhelmed by the destructive power he has just encountered. The scene shifts to Chapter 2, titled Toxic Resistance. Chris, leaning heavily on his weapon and exhausted, seethes with bitterness as he realizes he has been humiliated once more. Chris lies broken on the ground, barely whispering as he struggles to recover. Meanwhile, Aiden stands in the center of the devastation caused by his attack, screaming Chris' name into the void. A wide, silent view of the rugged wilderness stretches out under a heavy, overcast sky, as the echoes of the battle fade into the distance. The sheer power of the strike is evident as deep gashes scar the forest, leaving the trees severed and the air filled with drifting leaves. Struggling to catch his breath, Chris trudges through the silent, moonlit wilderness, moving away from the wreckage of the battle. Gasping for air, Chris continues his lonely trek through the woods, his body pushed to its absolute limit. Chris reaches the edge of a river, but his body has reached its limit. With a faint groan, his legs buckle, and he collapses onto the ground, completely overwhelmed by exhaustion. Sitting alone by the riverbank, Chris reflects on his narrow escape, wondering what he should do now that he has lost everything. Yet as he looks ahead, a determined smile forms on his face, signaling a shift in his resolve. Trembling with fear, Chris comes to a terrifying realization. His opponent wasn't just fighting him, he was seriously trying to kill him. He dreads the thought of the next encounter, knowing that if he is found again, he may not survive. Looking at the few things he has left, Chris realizes how desperate his situation has become. Fearing that someone might still be chasing him, he decides to hide deeper in the forest. However, As he leans against a tree, he laments that his injuries make it impossible for him to hunt animals or monsters for food. Chris stands amidst the towering trees of the desolate forest, looking ahead with uncertainty. A close-up of his leg reveals the bandages wrapped around his ankle, highlighting the physical toll of his struggle. Chris looks around the dense foliage, recalling the times he hunted in the Pasha forest with his father. However, he realizes he has never ventured this deep into the woods, where the silence is unsettling, and there is no sign of any animals or monsters. Amidst the oppressive silence of the deep forest, a dark, gaping opening appears between the massive rock formations, hinting at something hidden within. Chris finds solace in a simple cave, noting that he no longer has to worry about the rain and wind. After roughly cleaning the space, he accepts his current situation, knowing all that remains is to wait for time to pass. With no other food options available, Chris stares down at a large, striped bug. He looks on with reluctance, realizing that eating the creature is his last resort for survival. Realizing he needs more than just bugs to survive, Chris steps out of his cave to search for food. He discovers some peculiar plants in the forest, and recalls his toxic resistance skill, feeling relieved that this unexpected ability will prevent him from dying regardless of what he eats. Trusting in his unique ability, Chris takes a bite of the mysterious plant, finding it helpful for his survival in the wilderness. Chris continues his desperate search for food, tasting the strange flora of the forest. While he finds the leaves to be slightly sweet, the flowers and other plants are repulsive, leaving him with a taste of bitterness and astringency. Chris sighs as he looks up at the forest canopy, realizing that eating the strange plants is only making him feel more tired. Chris continues to examine the strange vegetation of the forest. He notices a peculiar rule for survival. The more bizarre a plant's appearance, the easier it is to eat and the less bitter it tastes, though the Manga remains an exception, with the food situation somewhat managed. Chris turns his attention to the next necessity for survival. Drinking water, however, his search proves disappointing, as he finds nothing but a murky, muddy puddle. Panic sets in as Chris realizes he has gone too far. Because he wasn't paying attention, he has wandered deep into the forest and can no longer remember the path back to the streams. Despite the distance, he desperately wants to return for water, but he is completely lost. Desperate and on the brink of dehydration, Chris finds a pool of dark, suspicious liquid. Remembering his toxic resistance skill, he convinces himself that it won't harm him, knowing that if he doesn't drink something soon, he will die. Chris takes a risk and drinks the dark liquid, but the taste is so repulsive that he immediately covers his face in distress. He looks down at the remaining fluid dripping from his hands with a look of pure disgust. Chris recoils in disgust, overwhelmed by the foul smell and bitter taste of the liquid. After gagging, he is left hiccuping, despairing over the fact that there is no decent drinking water or food to be found in this place. The moon rises high in the cloudy night sky. Below, Chris lies motionless on the cold ground, completely drained of energy after his desperate attempt to find sustenance. As he slips into unconsciousness, Chris' mind is flooded with fragmented memories. The image of his brother, Aiden, appears in a distorted, haunting vision, reflecting the deep psychological scars left by his family. Trapped in his unconscious state, Chris writhes in distress, lost within the bleak and fragmented landscape of his nightmares. The distorted visions transition into memories of his desperate struggle for survival. He is seen scavenging for insects to eat and huddling under a makeshift shelter during a heavy downpour. His expression hardened as he grips a crude, handmade weapon. A few days have passed since Chris entered the Pasha forest. After enduring endless hardship and hunger, he finally finds what he has been searching for, a piece of meat. Chris stares at the animal's corpse. Despite it being dead, he is relieved and excited, as it is the first animal he has found in the Pasha forest. Chris acknowledges that the meat is rotten and smells awful, but after days of eating only plants and insects, it seems like a feast to him. He decides to grill the meat with some vegetables, hoping it will improve the taste. The result of his desperate effort is revealed. Rotten meat grilled with rosemary, resting on a stone. Chris takes a bite of the makeshift meal. He admits to himself that it tastes the worst of any meat he has ever eaten, but in his current state of starvation, it feels like a super delicious dish. Looking at the dying embers of his campfire, Chris reflects on the rare and precious feeling of finally having a full stomach. Chris observes that while the forest isn't dangerous, the scarcity of living things makes finding food a constant struggle. He notices that his leg wound has almost completely recovered, possibly thanks to the herbs he has been consuming. Feeling stronger, he decides it is time to hunt for more animals and monsters, though the only sound filling the air is the chirping of birds. Just as Chris decides to hunt, a sudden rustle catches his attention. He freezes, listening intently to the mysterious sound breaking the silence of the forest. Chris carefully examines the surroundings, noticing traces on the grass and several footprints left behind. Catching the faint smell of beasts, he realizes he has finally found a target to hunt. Chris cautiously hides behind a massive tree, keeping a close eye on his surroundings. Once he finds the right opening, he drops into a low crouch, ready to strike the prey he has been tracking. Peering from behind the tree, Chris finally catches sight of the creature. He stares at it with a look of recognition, whispering to himself, "That is." Chris identifies the creature as an orc. In the harsh reality of the forest, it is a simple choice: attack or be attacked. Staring at the imposing creature, Chris recalls the only time he had seen an orc before. He remembers that even his father found them difficult to handle without the aid of skills, emphasizing the gravity of the fight he is about to enter. Chris looks at his homemade axe, knowing it is a dangerous and unreliable tool for such a fight. He reflects on his father's struggle, realizing that without skills, their strengths are similar, and this orc might be on his level. But suddenly, Chris stops hesitating and lunges forward with a powerful, explosive strike. With a sudden burst of speed, Chris leaps high into the air, bringing his homemade axe down upon his foe. Below him, the orc lets out a primal roar, driven by an insatiable hunger to eat meat. With a sudden and explosive movement, Chris swings his axe, striking the orc with full force as the creature barely has time to react. The axe strikes home with a heavy impact, cutting deep into the orc's body. Chris grits his teeth, his expression strained as he feels the force of the collision. The orc stands tall, its hulking frame looming over the scene, seemingly unfazed by the impact of the attack. Chris stands still, gripping his axe firmly as he faces the imposing orc, the tension mounting in the quiet of the forest. The orc retaliates with a violent surge of strength, slamming its massive club into the ground with a deafening crash that sends debris flying. Chris narrowly avoids the impact, watching the beast with a calm, focused expression. He notes to himself that, luckily, the creature didn't run away. The orc lets out a thunderous roar as its strike devastates the ground, sending debris flying everywhere. However, Chris reacts instantly, leaping clear of the impact zone. As the dust settles, the orc gasps for air, struggling to keep up with Chris' movements. With a sudden burst of speed, Chris slides across the earth, narrowly escaping the aftermath of the orc's massive strike. With a determined shout of "now," Chris leaps into action, delivering a devastating blow that creates a massive explosion of dust and debris upon impact. The orc is caught off guard, struggling to react to the sudden shift in momentum. The blow lands with devastating power, sending the orc reeling. However, the intensity of the clash is too much for Chris' weapon, which shatters into pieces, leaving him staring in shock. Chris stares in horror, realizing the devastating cost of his strike. With his only weapon shattered, he is now left vulnerable and defenseless against the massive orc. The impact of the strike was devastating. Even though his weapon was destroyed, the orc is sent crashing backward, leaving Chris stunned by the outcome. Chris stands over the fallen orc, questioning if his attack was fatal. As the orc lets out a faint, pained groan, Chris realizes that the creature isn't dead, but simply unable to move because the wound was too deep. Looking down at the fallen monster, Chris recalls the utility of his unique ability. Thanks to his poison resistance, he can consume meat even if it has begun to rot. Feeling that he should not let the creature's death go to waste, he decides to turn the orc into something delicious. Looking down at the carcass, Chris realizes that without a water source, harvesting the meat will be messy and difficult. However, with no other options, he decides to proceed anyway. Realizing that disassembling the orc right there would make it harder to move, Chris decides to haul the massive creature back to his base instead. Covered in blood and straining under the weight, he begins the arduous journey. As he makes his way back to base, Chris carries the massive orc carcass on his shoulders, noting that it isn't as heavy as he initially thought. Wiping the blood and grime from his face, Chris looks over the massive pile of butchered orc meat. He reflects on how time-consuming it was to cut up such a large creature. But seeing the abundance of food, he decides that the exhausting day was well worth the result. Chris begins organizing his harvest, hanging the large cuts of orc meat on a wooden rack. He decides to set aside enough for today and tomorrow, while planning to dry the rest for long-term storage. Eager to finally eat the meat, Chris realizes that his entire body reeks of blood. He makes his way to a small, muddy pond to wash up, though he worries about the water making him even dirtier. Having finally washed away the blood, Chris sets up a fire and begins roasting the orc meat, the juices dripping appetizingly into the flames. As the meat sizzles over the fire, Chris reflects on the fact that orcs are humanoid monsters and eating them is widely seen as a taboo. However, in his current desperate situation, he couldn't care less about such rules. Lifting the meat to his nose, he is surprised to realize that it doesn't smell rotten at all, but instead carries the scent of fresh meat. Chris takes a bite of the meat, chewing slowly at first. However, his expression quickly shifts to one of shock as he realizes that while it smells fresh, The taste is a completely different story. The problem is the taste. Suddenly, Chris' expression shifts to one of pure bliss. He is completely captivated by the taste, finding the meat incredibly juicy and sweet as the aroma spreads through his mouth. The taste is an explosion of flavor, feeling as though it went straight to his brain. It is an incredibly delicious and excellent dish. Sated and exhausted, Chris leans back, realizing he has already eaten the meat he had saved for tomorrow. He sighs and gives up on his plan to experiment with different cooking methods, as there is nothing left to prepare. Sated and exhausted from the meal, Chris lies flat on his back, staring blankly at the sky in a state of total contentment. As he relaxes, Chris remembers the struggle of the fight. He recalls how the orc's thick hair and skin acted as a natural defense, and how he had to dismantle the creature with his own hands, discovering armor-like muscles hidden beneath the fat. Lying back and gazing at the sky, Chris contemplates his growth. He recalls how he managed to crush the orc's head with nothing more than a wooden stick and carry the carcass back to the cave, realizing that such a feat would have been impossible for him until now. Chris ponders the source of his sudden power. He realizes that even with the role of a farmer, the ability enhancement makes it much easier to grow stronger, likely as a result of the ritual's blessings. However, he feels that his strength has been over-enhanced beyond normal limits. As he reflects on his newfound strength, Chris begins to wonder if his crushing defeat at the hands of Klaus was actually the catalyst for his growth. Chris considers the possibility that his body is undergoing a process similar to muscle hypertrophy, where breaking down leads to greater strength. While the rapid pace of his growth feels overwhelming, he ultimately finds solace in the fact that he was able to easily defeat the orc by himself. A montage of memories flashes by, showing Chris swinging his wooden stick with immense power and nourishing his body with food, embodying the cycle of breaking and rebuilding that led to his newfound strength. Chris spends his days trekking through the dense forest and reflecting in silence atop a hill. As night falls, he finds solace by a small campfire, continuing his journey of growth in complete isolation. A month has passed since Chris began his solitary life in the wild. Looking at the pile of bones left behind, he realizes that he has finally finished all the orc meat, noting that his past self would have simply thrown away what he couldn't eat. Standing amidst the silence of the forest, Chris contemplates the harsh reality of survival. He acknowledges the sheer pain of starvation, realizing that when life is on the line, he cannot afford to be pick-even if his only source of food is the monster he killed. Chris acknowledges that while he could stay in the Pasha forest longer, the lack of meat makes survival difficult. Thinking that things might have calmed down elsewhere, he decides to leave the wilderness and make his way to a city. With a clear purpose in mind, Chris walks away from the wilderness, focused on his singular goal, to survive and push his limits to become even stronger. Chris' expression turns resolute as images of his father, Leon, and Klaus flash through his mind. With a burning determination, he makes a silent vow to surprise them all with the strength he will acquire. The camera pans across the serene landscape of the Pasha forest, lingering on the riverbank and a worn piece of cloth left behind, marking the end of Chris' solitary survival. Before beginning his journey out of the forest, Chris takes a final bath in the river, surfacing with a deep breath to clear his mind. Floating in the river, Chris lets out a sigh of relief, glad to have returned to this spot. He reflects on the struggle of the past month, having survived on muddy and rainwater, making the simple taste of clean water feel like a luxury he once took for granted. After refreshing himself in the river, Chris looks at his ragged clothes hanging from a tree. Seeing the extent of the damage, he realizes that he cannot leave the forest and enter a city dressed in such a pathetic state. Chris holds up a leather bag crafted from orc skin, deciding to tie it around his waist. He figures that this makeshift solution is probably better than being mistaken for an exhibitionist. With his makeshift clothing secured, Chris leaves the depths of the Pasha forest behind. As he sets off toward the city of Realzad, a new chapter of his journey begins. As he steps out of the forest, Chris is greeted by the sight of Realzad city. Stunned by the scale and grandeur of the buildings before him, he can barely find the words to describe it. Realzad. This prosperous and crowded city, located near the royal capital Meldrake, is a far cry from the town where Chris once lived. As he looks around the bustling plaza, he realizes that this is the perfect place to disappear and hide above all. Chris thinks about Klaus, who, having received the Holy Sword Grace, is likely being summoned to the royal capital. Realizing that Realzad city's proximity to the capital makes it the perfect spot to spy on Klaus' movements without compromising his own safety, Chris decides to establish this city as his base. Relieved that the city guards didn't perform a thorough search, Chris successfully enters the city. However, he quickly realizes that his makeshift clothing makes him far too conspicuous. Looking at the few coins in his hand, he determines his immediate priorities: food, and a place to stay first, then weapons. As he gazes at the grand architecture of Realzad, he realizes he desperately needs more money to survive. Seeking a way to fund his survival, Chris enters a props shop named Goldbone. A shop employee offers to lead him to the appraiser's room to sell his belongings. As he follows, Chris reveals his plan to sell items he stole from his family home, trusting that a large company will be less likely to rip him off. Chris is led to the appraiser's room, where he is met by a man wearing a monocle. The man stares at Chris in silence for a moment, leaving Chris confused, before finally offering a hesitant welcome. Suddenly, the door slams open as a man bursts in, shouting in a rage. He berates Adden, questioning why someone of Chris' appearance was allowed in and scoffing that he couldn't possibly have anything valuable to sell. Chris remains silent, his expression darkening as he thinks to himself, "Damn it." Chris walks away from the shop, sighing in disappointment. He realizes he chose the wrong store to sell his items and admits to himself that it is difficult for anyone to trust someone dressed in such ragged clothes. Chris keeps a low profile, peering silently from behind a stone wall as he navigates the worn-down streets of the city, remaining vigilant of his surroundings. Chris walks through the slums, struck by the drastic difference in atmosphere. He finds it hard to believe that this rundown area is part of the same city, and as he observes the surroundings, he wonders what exactly is being sold in the strange covered tents. Chris pauses, glancing around with curiosity. He wishes the owners of the mysterious tents would put up signboards so he could know what they sell, as he feels it would be rude to simply peek inside. Unbeknownst to him, a hooded figure remains close, keeping a watchful eye on his movements. As Chris hesitates before the mysterious tents, the hooded figure who had been watching him finally reveals themselves. Rumi approaches him calmly, asking what is wrong and if he has lost his way, while holding a small, mysterious object in their hand. A small pouch flies through the air, heading straight toward a hand reaching out to catch it. The pouch hits Chris with surprising power, sending him reeling backward as he stares in utter disbelief. Clutching his chest in pain, Chris cries out, demanding to know what Rumi is doing. Rumi simply lets out a sharp shh in response. Chris glares at the pouch that hit him, his face twisting in annoyance as he shouts, "Damn it!" Stunned and frustrated, Chris realizes the truth about the object that struck him. He shouts in shock, realizing that Rumi has stolen his already stolen goods. Spotting the hooded figure attempting to flee, Chris shouts out in realization and begins to pursue Rumi through the crowded street, his eyes filled with determination. Chris pursues Rumi, noting how adept she is at disappearing into the crowd. Just as she seems to be slipping away, Chris prepares to make his move. Chris finally catches up to Rumi, grabbing her firmly by the hood to stop her escape. He scolds her, telling her that taking advantage of others' friendliness is a terrible thing to do, leaving Rumi completely bewildered. Rumi frantically struggles and screams for Chris to let her go, but he quickly shuts her down with a stern threat to punch her if she doesn't stop shouting. As he holds her firmly, Chris looks at her with a realization, admitting to himself that he had mistakenly thought she was just a child. Looking closer at the girl he caught, Chris is surprised to realize that Rumi isn't a small child, but is actually around the same age as him. Chris demands to know why Rumi stole his things, though he suddenly feels a bit guilty for his approach. Rumi, trembling and covering her mouth, is too scared to answer, fearing she'll be beaten if she speaks. Seeing her silence, Chris sternly warns her that if she doesn't talk, he'll be the one to beat her, leaving Rumi in tears. Rumi finally reveals the truth, admitting that she stole simply for the sake of surviving. However, she quickly becomes awkward and tells Chris not to ask her any further, hoping he will just accept her answer. Chris points out that Rumi's skill suggests she is an experienced thief. When she claims that is why she became one, Chris questions why she didn't target someone wealthier than himself, wondering to himself if she is lying or simply foolish. Chris continues to grill Rumi, questioning if she has any accomplices or weapons. When he asks if she has parents, Rumi's demeanor changes. She starts with a laugh, but quickly becomes thoughtful and hesitant. Rumi stammers in a panic, desperately trying to deny the truth. But Chris coldly points out that she is a terrible liar. Chris loses patience and tells Rumi to stop lying, threatening to take her to the soldiers if she doesn't tell the truth. Terrified of the authorities, Rumi finally breaks and confesses that she has an accomplice. She reveals that there are two of them living together in an abandoned building, a fact that Chris calmly acknowledges. Chris presses further, asking if the other person living in the abandoned building is also a thief. Rumi simply answers yes. Chris demands to know where the person Rumi lives with is located. Observing her sobbing and panicked state, he decides that she is likely telling the truth. He then tells her that she'll be safe as long as she can just lead him to that location. The scene shifts to a desolate, abandoned building. Inside the empty room, Rumi's accomplice sits alone, growing increasingly anxious. They wonder why Rumi is taking so long to return and fear that she might have been caught. Chris suddenly appears at the hideout, holding Rumi by the back of her cloak. As Rumi sheepishly admits she was caught, her accomplice reacts with a shout of pure frustration. Rumi's accomplice screams in frustration, questioning why Rumi would bring Chris to their hideout since she was already captured. Rumi frantically explains that Chris threatened her if she didn't comply. As the accomplice takes a combat stance and demands Chris drop his weapon, Chris calmly observes the man's technique. He notes that while the man seems to know some martial arts and sword techniques, his body balance is terrible, leading Chris to conclude that the accomplice is no match for him. Rumi's accomplice reacts defensively, shouting that they have no money to give. Chris remains calm, stating that he only came to deliver a warning. If the accomplice tries to steal from him again, he will not be so lenient. Chris makes it clear that he has no intention of asking for money. This leaves Rumi's accomplice completely stunned by the unexpected outcome. Meanwhile, Rumi, sitting on the floor, finds it wasteful that Chris only gave a warning. Chris proposes a deal, asking for information in return for his leniency. He admits that he has just arrived in Realzad and is unfamiliar with the city, specifically needing directions back to the central district. Relieved that Chris' request is simple, Rumi's accomplice agrees to help. Chris notes that information about the city is extremely important for him. He then turns to Rumi, calling her redhead, and demands her agreement to help. When a surprised Rumi asks if she is included, Chris reminds her that she was the direct culprit. Chris asks for their names, but the accomplice stubbornly refuses to cooperate. To their surprise, Chris reveals he already knows who they are, Hesta, and Rarf explaining that he simply overheard them calling each other by those names earlier. The scene shifts to a view of the rooftops as the conversation continues. Rarf finally gives in and agrees to help, but he quickly adds a stern warning, making it clear that his cooperation does not mean they are on friendly terms. As they step outside the abandoned building and head back toward the city, Chris looks at the duo. He sincerely thanks Rarf and Hesta, acknowledging that their assistance has been very helpful to him. As they move through the city, Chris glances back at Rarf and Hesta, noting their displeased expressions. He thinks to himself that regardless of whether they are thrilled or not, the fact that they helped him remains unchanged. As they prepare to head back, Chris stops them, noting that the most important location hasn't been mentioned yet. He asks Rarf and Hesta where they sell their stolen loot, and Rarf reveals it is a pawn shop run by an acquaintance. Intrigued that such shops still exist, Chris simply tells them to show him the way there. Chris attempts to put Rarf and Hesta at ease, claiming he has no bad intentions. However, he immediately follows up by stating that he simply wants to sell stolen goods, leaving Rarf completely bewildered. Rarf reacts with indignation, shouting that Chris is no different from them if he is also a thief. Chris calmly admits he only did it once, and that it was his father's belongings. But Rarf dismisses the excuse, insisting that stealing is stealing regardless of who the victim is. Chris remains indifferent to their lifestyle, stating that he will overlook their crimes as long as they guide him to his destination and leave his belongings alone. Relieved that they won't be turned in to the guards, Rarf seeks a final confirmation, which Chris calmly provides. The view shifts to the rooftops of Realzad. As the group continues their walk, they confirm that the place they are heading to is the final stop of their journey. The group finally arrives at their destination. As they step inside the pawn shop, they find themselves in a room filled with shelves of miscellaneous goods and storage drawers. As they look around the store, the person behind the counter notices the group and recognizes Rarf and Hesta. Avon looks at the group with curiosity, noting the presence of a stranger among the familiar faces. Rarf explains that they just met Chris today, and that he is looking to sell something, wondering if Avon would be interested in buying it. Avon agrees to the request, telling Chris that it is fine, and begins to explain the first step of the process. Avon asks Chris for his name. After Chris introduces himself, Avon compliments the name and introduces himself as Rugans, extending his hand in a friendly gesture. Chris responds politely, saying it is nice to meet him. A title page marks the beginning of Chapter 5, titled Adventurer, showing a friendly moment between Avon and Hesta. Avon looks over the collection of jewelry and accessories Chris has provided. Impressed by their quality, he tells Chris that the items are valuable and invites him to browse the shop while he performs a careful appraisal. As he looks around the shop, Chris picks up a sword and notices its price is 5 gold coins. He admits to himself that although the items are of great quality, he simply cannot afford them with the money he currently has. Comes across a book titled The Memoirs of Botanist Otto. He thinks to himself that he has never heard of the author, and that the book doesn't seem interesting, yet he finds himself strangely drawn to it. Chris realizes that the book is a rare ancient piece, but the price is far higher than he expected. Seeing the tag for 3 gold coins, he begins to wonder if there is something truly special hidden within its pages. Hesta curiously asks Chris if he is able to read the characters in the book. Chris calmly replies that he has been taught how to read since he was little. Realizing that Chris possesses a skill she lacks, Hesta looks at him with a bashful and intrigued expression. After a moment of silence, Avon calls out to them, apologizing for the wait and announcing that the appraisal is complete. Chris looks on with a questioning glance, while a flustered Hesta quickly tries to brush off their previous conversation, insisting it was nothing. Avon tells Chris that he is willing to purchase all the items, provided the price is agreeable. He begins by presenting the value of the jewelry, noting that the ring is worth 4 silver coins and the earrings are worth 2. Avon continues the appraisal, stating that the necklace is worth 3 gold coins. Chris is stunned by the unexpectedly high value of the item. Rarf is completely shocked that Avon is offering 3 gold coins, noting that such a high price is extremely rare. Avon explains that the necklace's value comes from the sapphire attached to it, and tells Rarf to stop eavesdropping on their negotiation. Intrigued and suspicious, Rarf begins to wonder if Chris actually comes from a rich family. Avon finishes the appraisal by presenting the final item, a pocket watch, and values it at 1 gold coin. Chris is taken aback that his father's pocket watch is only worth 1 gold coin, especially since his father treasured it so much. Despite the low appraisal, he decides to keep the watch and tells Avon that he will sell everything else. Chris finishes his business with Avon at the counter. He remains silent for a moment, perhaps reflecting on the value of the items he let go and the money he has gained. Chris thanks Avon for his help after receiving the coins. Avon explains that since the items are essentially stolen goods, he had to offer a lower price than their actual value, though he notes that both sides bound benefit from the arrangement. When Avon asks if there is anything else he has to sell, Chris initially says no, but then suddenly pauses, as he remembers something important he noticed. Avon presents a specific book to Chris, noting that very few people pay attention to it. Chris admits that based on the price, he had wondered if the author was someone of great significance, but Avon clarifies that the author is neither famous nor particularly extraordinary. Avon looks on with a calm expression as he explains the true value of the book, stating that for a knowledgeable person, its content is a masterpiece that surpasses any other literary work. Chris admits that he is genuinely intrigued by the book, but unfortunately, it is currently beyond his means. He expresses his hope that if the book is still available, the next time he visits the shop, Avon will sell it to him. Avon simply hums in response. Considering the request, Avon makes an unexpected offer, telling Chris that he can take the book and simply return to pay him back once he has the money. Chris is completely caught off guard by the shopkeeper's sudden kindness. Chris is hesitant, questioning if he can really accept such a generous offer while admitting he feels awkward since he is just a guest selling stolen goods. Avon simply chuckles and reassures him, stating that not everyone would be so kind as to make such an offer. Avon continues to reassure Chris, explaining that because the book has been sitting unsold for years, any payment Chris makes in the future will still be a profit. He tells Chris that letting him take the book now causes him no trouble at all. Avon asks Chris if he'll take the book, and when Chris questions how he can possibly pay, Avon casually suggests that he can just collect the money from Rarf if Chris fails to do so. Chris thinks to himself that there is no reason to refuse such a deal, but Rarf suddenly erupts in a panic, shouting that he absolutely will not pay for Chris. Avon simply chuckles at Rarf's desperate reaction. Leaving the pawn shop, Chris expresses his gratitude to Rarf and Hesta, mentioning that he made more money than he had expected. Rarf remarks on how lucky Chris is to earn so much instantly. When Chris kindly offers to treat them to a meal, Rarf is momentarily surprised and pleased, but he quickly snaps back to reality. Realizing they haven't earned a single coin themselves, Rarf shouts that they must find something to sell. Chris agrees, though he privately thinks it would be much better if someone just invited them to eat instead. Rarf is left completely stunned and flustered, his expression shifting to one of pure shock as he processes the situation. Hesta suggests that they let Chris treat them to a meal, since they have no money of their own. Rarf is bewildered, questioning why Chris would be so generous to people who had tried to steal from him. Chris simply explains that it is a gesture of gratitude for introducing him to the shop, though he privately admits to himself that he doesn't have much to spare. Chris looks on thoughtfully, reflecting on his recent solitude. He admits that after living alone in the forest for the past month, the simple act of having company makes him feel comfortable, regardless of the fact that Rarf and Hesta are thieves. The group arrives at a local eatery. The atmosphere is lively as they settle in and are served a spread of delicious food, fulfilling Chris' promise to treat them. Chris, Rarf, and Hesta settle in at the tavern, sharing a meal and enjoying each other's company amidst the bustling atmosphere of the restaurant. Rarf and Hesta watch in utter disbelief as Chris devours his meal with surprising intensity. Surrounded by piles of empty plates on both sides, Chris continues to eat relentlessly, leaving his companions speechless at his appetite. Chris explains that his ravenous appetite comes from the time he spent in the forest, where he had to survive on nothing but unseasoned orc meat. Hesta quickly asks him to stop mentioning it, while Rarf remarks that Chris' food somehow looks much tastier than his own. Rarf expresses his amazement that Chris managed to survive a whole month in the forest without any supplies. Chris recalls the struggle, admitting that in the beginning, he ate whatever he could find, and even drank muddy water just to avoid starving. While acknowledging that eating poisonous plants would normally be fatal, Chris calmly reveals the secret to his survival: his unique skill, toxic resistance, leaving Rarf completely stunned. Shocked by the revelation, Rarf asks how Chris can mention such a skill so casually. Chris simply responds that whether he has that skill or not, nothing really changes. Rarf mentions that he knows others with the toxic resistance skill, but for them, it only lessens the pain of poison or makes them better at drinking alcohol. He comments on how easygoing Chris is, but Chris simply explains that he ate everything suspicious in the forest and remained completely unaffected. Hesta's eyes widen in shock as the realization hits her. She suddenly understands that Chris' absolute resistance to poison is exactly why her aloe ball had no effect on him. Chris mentions that the red object flew straight into his eyes, leaving Rarf completely baffled. Rarf explains that the aloe ball contains a strong anesthetic that would normally leave a person unable to move for a whole day, prompting Chris to comment on how dangerous such items are. Rarf is amazed that even the aloe ball had no effect on Chris. He suggests that Chris' skill is no longer just toxic resistance, but has likely become toxic nullification. Chris, however, remains unfazed, simply stating that it isn't something he needs to use often anyway. Rarf asks Chris what he plans to do now. Chris calmly reveals his intention to become an adventurer, explaining that his basic knowledge of swordsmanship should allow him to earn enough money to survive. Rarf notes that wanderers typically end up as either adventurers or criminals. Rarf turns to Hesta, asking if she intends to keep stealing just to survive. Chris, remaining indifferent, counters by asking what the two of them plan to do. Rarf explains that since they lack the strength to become adventurers, they only have their tainted hands to rely on, confirming that this is his plan. Chris listens in silence, thinking that Rarf might be being a bit too honest. Chris looks at the two of them with a serious expression, warning them that if anyone other than him had caught them, they would already be in prison. He sincerely suggests that they should find another way to live. Chris makes his way to the Adventurers Guild. Stepping inside the bustling hall, he sees other adventurers gathered around the quest board, ready to take the first step toward his new life. A smiling guild receptionist informs Chris that the registration fee for becoming an adventurer is 1 silver coin. Chris simply agrees and places the coin on the counter. Tali explains that his personal information will be registered using magic and asks for his name and age. Chris begins to state his full name but quickly changes his mind, deciding that just Chris is enough. He then adds that he is 16 years old as the magic orb begins to glow. Tali informs Chris that his registration is now complete and hands him his official guild card. She explains that the card is essential for accepting quests, trading goods, and tracking his rank within the guild, while also serving as his identification. After warning him not to lose it, she asks if he has any further questions. Chris asks if he can take any quest he wants, but Tali informs him that he is limited to beginner-level quests for now. When Chris asks about the ranking system, Tali explains that higher ranks allow for more difficult quests and are earned through a high completion rate. She shows him a rank pyramid, listing the levels from rookie up to the legendary Hihirokane, though she notes that the highest ranks are extremely rare. Tali further explains that ranking up depends on a combination of appropriate skills, professions, and the number of quests completed. Curious about the requirements, Chris asks if there are specific abilities needed for each rank, to which Tali acknowledges. Chris thanks Tali for the information and asks a follow-up question. Tali explains that for rookies, all basic stats including endurance, muscle strength, stamina, magic power, and agility must be at 10. However, Chris adds that bronze requires 20 and silver requires 40, noting that the requirements seemingly double with each rank. This unexpected knowledge leaves Tali speechless and visibly surprised. Tali is completely stunned. Left speechless by Chris' unexpected knowledge, she asks in disbelief if he's serious, to which Chris simply replies that he is fine for now. Still puzzled and wondering if magic was involved, Tali eventually regains her composure and asks if there is anything else he wants to know. Tali wishes Chris luck with his new journey as an adventurer, and he thanks her before departing. Soon after, Chris arrives at a forest, having accepted a quest for goblin extermination, where he comes face-to-face with a goblin. The quest details are clear. 2 copper coins for every goblin slain, provided the left ear is brought back as proof. As Chris makes his way through the dense forest grass, he is unaware that a goblin is already lurking nearby, watching him. Remembering how he failed when facing an orc in the past, Chris determines not to repeat the same mistake. With sharp focus, he swings his weapon down, aiming to land a decisive and accurate blow on the goblin. With a swift and decisive motion, Chris delivers a powerful slash, cutting the goblin clean in half. Chris stands over the bisected goblin, his sword still dripping with blood. As he looks down at the monster, a look of confusion crosses his face, and he mutters to himself that something is strange. Chris reflects on the stark difference between this fight and his previous encounter with an orc. He finds it absurd how effortlessly he sliced the goblin in half, leading him to the realization that he has gained some kind of extraordinary power. After officially becoming an adventurer, Chris spends the next 2 months focusing solely on hunting goblins, utilizing his extraordinary power to grow stronger. Eventually, he makes his way back to the town. Yawning as he enters his room, Chris reflects on how his life in the city has become a repetitive routine. Though one particular thing has changed. A bright-eyed, red-haired girl greets Chris with a smile, letting him know that breakfast is ready. Chris reflects on his current living arrangement, explaining that he has begun living with a pair of thieves. As one of them, a blonde-haired man, heads out for the day. He asks Chris to close the door behind them, to which Chris simply agrees. Chris recalls how Dane and Ari, after being caught by him, pleaded to live together to share the cost of a cheap hostel. Having reached their limit as thieves, they turned their lives around and became adventurers. With their combined efforts, Chris finds himself well provided for, and his own rank as an adventurer has just risen. To verify a hypothesis, Chris decides to head to the Pacious the following day. He is studying a book titled The Memoirs of Botanist Otto, which provides detailed and interesting information on legendary plant species. He is particularly drawn to the notes regarding unknown plants with incurable toxins. A mysterious and ominous plant is shown, representing the dangerous flora Chris intends to find and study. Chris notes that some poisonous plants have extremely strong toxic effects that are still a mystery. However, he recalls that among the plants he has eaten in the forest, there is one that can actually enhance the body, leading him to wonder about the possibilities. With a look of determination, Chris reaches a conclusion. He realizes that if he can harness the power of those mysterious plants, he might finally be able to become stronger. Chris arrives at a magnificent church, accompanied by Rhea. Seeking to confirm his progress, he explains that he wants to use the church's services to update his adventurer card and finally see the current state of his abilities after consuming the mysterious plants. Upon arriving at the church, Chris discovers that verifying his progress isn't simple. He is told that it costs 1 gold coin to determine if his abilities have actually changed. Chris tells the church official that he wants to have his abilities checked. The official greets him and, recognizing him as an adventurer, instructs him to go to the next room and wait for a moment. Chris thanks him and proceeds to the designated area. Chris stares at the crystal ball, sighing as he thinks about how expensive the test is. His thoughts are interrupted when a man enters the room, apologizing for the wait and introducing himself as Priest Graham, the parish priest of the church. Chris thanks the priest for the warm welcome, while Graham introduces himself as the parish priest of the church. Priest Graham initially assumes Chris might be there for a confession, but Chris quickly clarifies that he only wants his abilities checked. Graham agrees, requesting 1 gold coin and Chris' adventurer card. With the requirements met, Graham activates a glowing crystal ball to assess Chris' current status. Priest Graham informs Chris that he must leave to attend a holy ceremony. Chris politely acknowledges him as Graham hands back the adventurer card. Chris looks down at his adventurer card, reviewing the results of the ability check. His status confirms his profession as a farmer and reveals a special skill, poison nullification, along with some increases in his physical attributes. Despite the progress, Chris sighs, wishing the numbers were even higher. Chris contemplates his status, noting that while the numbers accurately reflect his current physical strength and abilities, they are disappointingly low, with most of his stats remaining in the single digits. He realizes he is still far from reaching the level of a rookie adventurer. Chris examines the numbers in parentheses on his card, realizing that these additions represent the strength he gained from eating strange plants. He also notices that his skill is listed as poison nullification rather than toxic resistance, leading him to wonder if the parish priest had misspoken. With a new understanding of his abilities, Chris packs his bags and prepares to leave. As he gets ready to depart, Ari looks on in confusion, questioning where he is headed. Chris apologizes to Ari for waking her up, explaining that he has urgent business to attend to and won't be returning for some time. He asks her to pass the message along to Rarf and reassures her that the rent for his absence has already been paid. With a final farewell, Chris leaves his sleeping roommate Dane behind and sets off into the night. With his gear packed and his destination in mind, Chris begins his journey. He leaves the town behind, walking through a wide mountainous landscape and venturing deep into the thick wilderness. As he makes his way through the dense forest, Chris reflects on the harshness of his journey. He realizes that without his poison nullification ability, he would have perished long ago due to the lack of proper food and drink. Chris comes across a peculiar creature and observes with curiosity that it doesn't reproduce. Continuing his exploration, he ventures into a narrow rocky crevice and keeps moving forward through the dense woods. As he continues his exploration, Chris spots a small flowering plant and carefully plucks it. Sitting amidst the forest, Chris carefully notes down his findings in a journal. He recalls the 2 months he spent gathering intelligence from pharmacies, equipment shops, and healing guilds in Realzad, realizing that the medicinal plants sold in the city can also be found here in the wilderness. Chris continues his research, deciding that for this verification process, he will only gather unknown plant species. As he looks out over the dense forest, he reflects last hot, realizing that because he was solely focused on survival back then, he doesn't remember much of what he ate, information that would have saved him a great deal of time now. Chris tries tasting some mushrooms, initially recalling that the taste wasn't too bad. However, as the flavor settles, he is hit with a foul, sour aftertaste that leaves him feeling disgusted. Sitting by his campfire, Chris continues to grimace from the unpleasant taste. He reflects that, despite the dry sensation lingering on his tongue, these mushrooms are still better than the bitter-tasting plants he had to endure in the past. Chris decides to move on to the next specimen, however. As soon as he tastes the strange heart-shaped plant, he is hit with a wave of disgust, causing him to gag. Chris is completely repulsed, his face contorting in disgust as the sour and rotten flavor hits. He quickly realizes the horrifying truth. The specimen was an insect-eating plant, and he had just tasted an insect that hadn't been fully digested. Still reeling from the foul taste, Chris admits that the plant is definitely not suitable for eating. Despite the setback, he looks at his gathered specimens and notebook. Steeling his resolve, he reminds himself that he cannot give up, as his current goal is to collect 30 different species of poisonous plants. With a renewed sense of purpose, Chris continues his trek through the forest. He carefully picks a new specimen and records it in his notebook, methodically gathering the samples he needs. After a week of diligent searching, Chris has finally achieved his goal of gathering 30 poisonous plant species. Reflecting on his journey, he admits he was worried at first, but he found the deep forest to be a peaceful sanctuary devoid of magical beasts. As he makes his way through the greenery, he decides that the next time he returns, he will do so with a more relaxed, vacation-like mindset. While recalling the struggle of eating those terrible plants for every meal, the scene shifts away from the forest, revealing a magnificent and ornate noble estate. With his task finished, Chris stands before the towering architecture of the grand noble estate, looking up at the residence he once belonged to. Upon entering the estate, Chris is greeted by his father, Leon. When Leon asks if he is the one who returned so soon for a checkup, Chris politely apologizes for the bother. As Leon prepares the testing equipment, he remarks that it has only been a few days, making it unlikely that Chris' abilities have changed. Leon completes the evaluation and hands the results over to Chris, stating that it is done. Chris politely thanks his father, to which Leon responds that as long as Chris is willing, there is no issue. Chris looks at the results with apprehension, fearing that his efforts gathering poisonous plants would be a waste if he saw no progress. However, as he scans the card, his eyes widen in shock as physical strength and endurance stats have increased by 1. Realizing that some of the plants he gathered in the forest can actually increase his abilities, Chris is filled with determination. He looks at his status card and clenches his fist, vowing to do whatever it takes to gain more strength and strive for a higher goal. Dane shouts at Chris, demanding to know why he vanished for an entire week without saying a word. Chris calmly responds that he had asked Hesta to pass on the message, while Hesta apologizes timidly in the background. Dane grabs Chris, insisting that he should have heard the news directly from him. Dane continues his interrogation, loudly demanding to know where Chris went and panicking at the thought that Chris might be leaving the lodging. Chris calmly tells him to relax, clarifying that he never said he was leaving. To soothe the situation, Chris hands Dane a skewer of food, telling him it is his portion. Dane persists in his curiosity, demanding to know where Chris had actually gone. Chris sighs internally, realizing that he will have to provide some explanation to get Dane to stop asking. However, the food quickly cheers Dane up. He thanks Chris and jokingly asks to be invited to something else. Once Chris becomes a successful adventurer, Chris explains to Dane that he had to return to the forest for a week because something had been bothering him. While Dane acknowledges this, he is more interested in Chris' current status, asking how his job as an adventurer is going. A heavy silence falls between Dane and Hesta as they eat. In a moment of raw honesty, they admit to themselves that they are completely useless. Dane calculates the cost of their survival, realizing that hunting 5 goblins a day barely covers the rent and food. He reflects on how precarious their situation is, especially if an injury occurs. While Chris acknowledges the difficulty, Dane almost suggests a way out, but hesitates and cuts himself off. A heavy silence settles over them. Chris looks on as Dane holds his food, both lost in thought about the precariousness of their lives. Breaking the heavy silence, Dane enthusiastically suggests that they form a party. Chris immediately shuts him down, claiming he doesn't have enough spare money. However, Dane and Hesta aren't buying it. Dane shouts that Chris is lying, pointing out that he survived a whole week without working, and even bought them yakitori. With a determined and serious expression, Chris firmly declares that whatever he can afford now is the direct result of his own hard work. Dane snaps in frustration, telling them to give back the food if it only leads to conflict. Chris, however, understands the desperation behind Dane's anger, even though he admits he cannot offer any financial assistance, softening. Dane realizes his mistake and offers a sincere apology to Chris. Dane attempts to break the silence by calling out to Chris. However, Chris remains distant, privately wondering if there is any actual value to be gained from forming a partnership with them. Seeking to determine their utility, Chris asks Dane and Hesta about their compatible professions and skills. Dane reacts with suspicion, questioning why anyone would reveal their weaknesses to others and dismissing his own abilities as ordinary. Chris calmly dismisses his concerns, stating that if he intended to kill them, he would have done so long ago, and reminds Dane that he has already shared his own information. Hesta opens up to Chris, revealing that her compatible profession is a wizard, and her specific skill is magic healing. Dane reacts with shock and frustration, shouting at Hesta for revealing her secrets. Hesta, however, remains calm and tells him that she doesn't mind sharing the information since it is Chris. The wizard is described as one of the most unconventional and weirdest combat-related professions. To master magic, one must first overcome the extreme difficulty of manipulating magic power. This requires either attending a magic school reserved for high nobility or those with top-tier professions from the blessing ceremony or self-studying from grimoires, which are often exorbitantly priced and written in ancient scripts. Hesta admits that she started stealing just to earn enough money to buy magic grimoires, driven by the potential of the wizard profession and her own desire to achieve it. Chris reflects on her situation, noting that while it is better than his own farmer profession, it is still an unlucky path to walk. Hesta simply agrees with him. Hesta brings up a memory from the first day they met, recalling how Chris asked if she could read a certain book while they were at the Misfortune family. Surprised that she remembered such a small detail, Chris simply explains that he was just curious at the time. Fidgeting nervously, Hesta hesitates before speaking up. She admits she has a request. If she can manage to get her hands on a magic grimoire, she asks Chris if he can teach her how to read. Chris calmly agrees to Hesta's request. As he looks at her, he realizes that if Hesta masters magic, her potential as a wizard could eventually make her just as powerful as any high-level combat professional. Hesta's eyes light up, and her cheeks flush with joy, completely touched by Chris' willingness to help her. Overjoyed by Chris' kindness, Hesta beams with a bright smile and gives him a heartfelt thank you. Beside her, Dane can only watch in silence, looking slightly bewildered by her sudden burst of excitement. Chris asks about Ralph, but Dane stubbornly refuses to give any information. However, Hesta unexpectedly blurts out that Ralph is a holy knight, detailing his powerful skills like Divine Strike and Divine Guardian, leaving Dane flustered. Chris muses over the fact that Ralph is a holy knight, while Dane screams in utter dismay at Hesta's lack of discretion. A conceptual image of a holy knight in ornate armor appears, explaining that it is a high-ranking combat profession. Those who hold this class can join the Royal Guard, or choose to become adventurers, ranking it among the top professions. Hesta explains that Ralph was seriously injured as a child, leaving him with a knee that still causes him pain and limits his movement. Chris realizes this explains why Ralph's balance was strangely bad despite his smooth dagger technique. Meanwhile, Dane is annoyed that Hesta has let the secret slip. Dane admits that he accepted his own streak of bad luck a long time ago. He notes that they have all been quite unfortunate, jokingly remarking that they are probably the only combat party in existence that manages to trip over goblins. Chris suggests that everything would be fine if Ralph's knee could be healed. However, Dane solemnly explains that since childhood, village doctors had told him it couldn't be completely treated. When Chris asks why he gave up so easily, Dane defensively claims he didn't give up at first and searched for other doctors, though his expression suggests a bleak outcome. Dane's voice is heavy with despair as he admits the harsh truth. Despite all his searching, there was simply no way to cure Raph's injury. Chris looks at Dane, reflecting on the hardships he must have faced. He compares Dane's situation to that of abandoned children, those with no money or status who try their best but get nowhere. Dane listens quietly before responding cryptically, stating that while he can't say for sure, it won't be long. Looking at his companions, Chris acknowledges that both Dane and Hesta have potential. With a determined expression, he proposes that they form a party together. Hesta beams with joy while Dane looks on, surprised by the offer. However, Chris falls into a moment of introspection, realizing the irony of using the blessing ceremony results to judge others when he himself was cast aside because of it. He then turns to them, stating that he doesn't feel like teaming up as they are now, which leaves Dane completely bewildered. Chris clarifies his stance, stating that he has his own tasks to attend to, and will only form a party once Dane and Hesta have gained enough skill to hunt goblins with ease. Dane is taken aback, shouting that the very reason he wanted a party was because they cannot hunt goblins properly. Chris bluntly tells him that his logic is putting the cart before the horse, leaving Dane speechless while Hesta agrees with Chris' reasoning. Dane shouts in disbelief at Chris' stubborn logic. Beside him, Hesta remains quiet, her gaze turning sharp and determined as she processes the challenge set before them. With the terms firmly set, Chris concludes the matter, leaving a bewildered Dane to react. Shortly after, the scene shifts to the guild, where Chris declares his intention to take on a quest. Tali smiles as she delivers the news, informing Chris that he can now take on bronze-level quests, and asking if he is interested in trying one. Chris asks Tali what kind of bronze-level quests he can take. Tali explains that there are several types of quests from that level upwards, and asks if he wants ones involving a large or small number of exterminations. Chris simply replies that he wants just a few. Tali takes a look at a few quest sheets, carefully reviewing the options that fit Chris' preference for a small number of exterminations. The available options include exterminating lost cattle birds, baby lizards, bubble wisps in an abandoned village to the east, and hedgerow slimes in the lower reaches of the Maitreya River. Chris questions why some quests have specific locations while others do not. Tali explains that for the quest she presented, exterminating just one individual is sufficient for completion. Tali explains that quests without designated locations are typically requested by people seeking specific monster materials, requiring the adventurer to bring back the monster's body or parts. Chris realizes that quests with designated locations are meant for exterminating monsters that are causing harm, which Tali confirms. Tali continues her explanation, detailing that quests without designated locations involve gathering information, hunting the monsters, and bringing back materials. She adds that although this process takes more time and effort, the rewards are often higher. Chris asks which of the available quests offers the highest reward. Tali explains that exterminating lost cattle birds for a meat processing shop is the most lucrative, paying between 1 and 3 gold coins depending on the quality of the carcass. Shocked by the high amount, Chris then asks about the lowest paying options, and Tali notes that hedgerow slimes and bubble wisps only pay 4 silver coins. Chris is stunned to realize that even the lowest paying bronze level quest is worth as much as defeating 20 goblins. Although the lost cattle bird quest offers the highest reward, he suspects there must be a reason for such a high price. With the risk of running out of money looming over him, Chris must now decide which quest to pursue. The scene transitions to a serene yet mysterious landscape of rivers and forests. As Chapter 8 begins, titled Mission Conquest, the focus shifts to the wild, where nature hides the targets of Chris' mission. Chris leans against a tree in the quiet wilderness, gazing out at the open landscape as he prepares himself for the challenges of his new mission. Scanning the landscape, Chris spots something in the distance. With a determined step forward, he finds exactly what he was looking for, a hedgerow slime. As Chris observes the hedgerow slime up close, he is overcome with disgust by its repulsive look. Chris reflects on his choice, realizing that the mission might be more troublesome than he anticipated, as the slime's stench could ruin his gear. Despite his hesitation, his lack of funds leaves him no choice but to push through. Hiding behind a tree, he carefully observes the hedgerow slime, noting that it is as tall as he is and identifying a dark spot as its core, reminding himself to remain cautious. With a determined expression, Chris charges forward, aiming for a single decisive strike to finish the monster in one go. He swings his blade with full force, creating a massive impact as he strikes the creature. With a powerful and precise swing, Chris drives his blade straight through the hedgerow slime's core, delivering a crushing blow to the monster. The impact of the strike causes a violent reaction, but as Chris slides back across the ground, he realizes with frustration that a single blow was not enough to take down the monster. Determined not to let the monster escape, Chris readies his blade for another assault. Once more, he declares, leaping back into the fray. With a surge of strength, crings his blade down in a powerful, decisive strike. The impact is immense, completely shattering the Hedro slime's core and ending the fight. With the monster finally defeated, Chris finds himself drenched in the foul, sticky remains of the slime. Groaning in disgust, he makes his way to a nearby stream to wash off the filth, swearing to himself that he will never accept a mission like this ever again. The view shifts to a towering stone wall, standing firm amidst the lush greenery of the surrounding wilderness. A month has passed since the incident with the Hedro slime. Having learned his lesson, Chris now completes bronze-ranked missions without difficulty. He spends his days honing his swordsmanship and studying plants at the Healing Guild and herb shops, while his afternoons are reserved for reports and preparation for the next day. Looking at the pile of coins, Chris is amazed by his earnings. By working tirelessly for a month and earning at least 4 silver coins every day, he has managed to save up 20 gold coins. Chris reveals that he has been visiting Shichifukuya frequently. Upon entering, the shopkeeper greets him and asks if he is there to look at weapons, but Chris clarifies that he has come to pay for a book. The shopkeeper then apologizes for making him wait. The shopkeeper asks Chris if he has enough money now, kindly suggesting that he only pay whatever amount he can afford in advance. However, Chris confidently replies that he has enough money to pay and tells the man not to worry. Chris thinks back to how the book Memoirs of the Botanist Otto was crucial in helping him understand the potential of poisonous plants, feeling deeply grateful to the shopkeeper. After handing over the payment, Chris thanks the shopkeeper for the book's usefulness, to which the shopkeeper humbly replies that he should be the one giving thanks. Just as he is about to finish, Chris remembers something. He turns to the shopkeeper and asks if the shop sells necromancy scrolls, leaving the man looking thoughtful. The shopkeeper searches through his storage and finds a set of scrolls. He hands them to Chris, mentioning that although they are a bit old, they are indeed the necromancy scrolls he was asking about. Chris looks closely at the mysterious necromancy scroll, questioning its nature. The shopkeeper explains that the lenient, pay-later arrangement was a special favor granted only to Chris, as Hesta would have likely run away if given the same opportunity. He further reveals that Hesta had actually requested him to keep the scroll and not sell it. Realizing this, Chris begins to question his assumptions about the relationship between the shopkeeper and Hesta. The shopkeeper remarks that his willingness to help Chris stems from their long history together, though he observes that there doesn't seem to be much trust between Chris and Hesta. Chris asks the shopkeeper for the price of the item. When the shopkeeper reveals it costs 2 platinum coins, Chris is completely stunned by the exorbitant amount. As he looks at the glowing book, he recalls how he spent an entire day debating the purchase, knowing that a single platinum coin is worth 10 gold coins. The shopkeeper admits that the item has been sitting on the shelf for a long time, as few people visiting these alleys are foolish enough to pay such a steep price. Chris, still reeling from the shock, can't believe how expensive the item actually is. The shopkeeper admits that because the item is so expensive, he normally would have asked for money in advance. But because it is Chris, he agrees to let him pay the full amount later. Chris is genuinely surprised by the offer. As he considers the purchase, he thinks about Hesta, noting that the purpose of the necromancy scroll is to help her learn magic. As she currently has no hope of using it herself, Chris reflects on the potential of Hesta's growth, believing that if she masters magic, she will become a valuable asset. He further considers the strategic advantage of joining forces with the mysterious Rumi for his own benefit. Despite the shopkeeper's kindness, Chris decides to decline the offer to pay later. He reflects that he cannot afford to be in debt, simply for Hesta's benefit. The shopkeeper accepts this, telling him that he is welcome to come back and buy the item anytime. With a polite thank you, Chris departs from the shop. After leaving the shop, Chris examines the poisonous plants he gathered from the forest. He reveals that he has already eaten half of the dried plants to develop his resistance, though he recalls with a grimace how incredibly bitter they became during the drying process. With some spare money available, he decides to visit the church to see how these efforts have impacted his status. Walking through the streets, Chris realizes that he needs to study more about the proper way to consume the poisonous plants to effectively build his resistance. As he makes his way through the town, Chris recalls that his previous consumption of poisonous plants increased his endurance and physical strength. He hopes for a similar result this time to determine if the remaining plants still offer benefits, though he worries about an uneven increase. Finally, he arrives before the grand church to verify his status. Chris enters the church and stands before a church official. As he waits in silence, he worries that since the church is unaware of his specific goals, they might simply assume he is there to throw money at them. Chris approaches the church official, politely apologizing for bothering him again. The official is taken aback, wondering why Chris needs another ability check so soon after the last one. Chris reassures him that he won't complain regardless of whether his stats have changed, and the official reluctantly agrees to help. Sunlight streams through the church windows as the official finishes the procedure. Holding up the result card, the official informs Chris that the check is done. The church official gives Chris a reassuring smile, telling him that the determination process did not fail even if his abilities remained the same. Chris listens silently, his expression remaining neutral as he processes the official's words. Chris tells the church official that he understands, and there is no need to keep repeating the same explanation. Feeling a bit flustered, the official apologizes for being so persistent and politely excuses himself. Chris looks over his status card, noting that both his endurance and muscle strength have increased by 1 point. He concludes that this improvement is likely the result of his own hard work and efforts during a month of hunting demons. Chris looks on with a skeptical expression, questioning why hunting so many demons for an entire month only resulted in a stat increase as minimal as eating plants. While disappointed by his slow progress from hunting, Chris considers another possibility. He believes that certain poisonous plants might hold the ability to make him stronger. Although the plants he ate this time didn't enhance his abilities, he worries that drying them might have rendered them ineffective. Determined to find a way to grow, he resolves to eat the remaining 15 types of poisonous plants to be certain. Chris walks away from the church, his thoughts still lingering on his status and the poisonous plants. As he reaches a building, he stops abruptly, letting out a confused "huh" as he spots something. Chris and a young dark-haired girl kneel side by side on the wooden floor, their expressions solemn as they wait. Ruma's accomplice walks into the room and is immediately confused by the sight of Chris and Lena kneeling together. He looks at them and asks, "What are you guys doing?" Lena urgently calls out to Chris. Nearby, Hesta strikes Rarf, telling him to shut up after he begins to speak. They then mention that they have enough strength to easily defeat goblins. Lena bows deeply and pleads with Chris, asking him to join their party. Chris remains silent, looking down at Lena and Rarf in his mind. He recalls how they used to return home completely exhausted, but lately they've seemed much more at ease. He realizes that the moment he had been expecting has arrived far sooner than he thought. Chris finally gives his answer, agreeing to join them. Lena is overjoyed, and Chris tells them that he will come along tomorrow to see the situation for himself. Chris considers that since Lena and Rarf can easily defeat goblins, partnering with them would be beneficial. As they walk through the town under the night sky, Chris offers them some grilled skewers he bought, which they gratefully accept. In the quiet of the night, Chris carefully records his observations and strategies in a book, the flickering candlelight illuminating the pages as he plans his next steps. Chris meticulously records his findings, noting that the poisonous herbs he consumed today failed to enhance his abilities. He decides to disregard 15 types of plants to avoid wasting money and effort, though he remains committed to the struggle of becoming stronger. Just as he is deep in thought, Dane calls out to him. Dane notices a pile of dried grass in the room and asks what it is. Chris calmly responds that it is probably fatal, leaving Dane completely shocked. Dane is baffled and asks why Chris would bring such dangerous things into their home, wondering if he's selling them for extra money. Chris calmly explains that the herbs are for his own consumption, reminding Dane about his poison nullification skill. Despite Dane's confusion over why anyone would intentionally eat poisonous grass, Chris bluntly admits that it tastes terrible, leaving Dane completely stunned. Chris and Dane are both breathing heavily as they move. However, the contrast is stark. Dane is completely worn out, gasping for air and questioning his own endurance as he struggles to keep pace. Dane admits that he is the one slowing them down. Chris remains silent for a moment, wondering why they had to leave so early. Seeing Dane struggle, Chris bluntly tells him he is too slow and offers to carry him on his back. Despite Dane's surprised refusal and insistence that he can walk on his own, Chris takes a stern tone, stating that if they cannot work together as a team, he will cancel the party plan entirely. Overwhelmed by Chris' ultimatum, Dane is left shivering in distress. Aerie stands beside him, staring silently at his pathetic state. As the story moves into Chapter 9, titled Party Formation, prepare for their journey, raising the question of how Hesta and Rarf will fare against the goblins. Chris looks at his companions with a serious gaze, demanding that they show him how easily they can hunt goblins. Rarf looks slightly intimidated as he reluctantly agrees, while Hesta confidently acknowledges the request. Hesta looks toward Rarf and tells him to do it just like always. Rarf responds with confidence, telling her to leave it to him. Moving silently through the dense undergrowth, Rarf leads the way while Chris and Hesta follow closely behind. The only sound is the soft rustle of the grass. Suddenly, Rarf raises his hand, signaling a sharp stop as a goblin appears right before them. Rarf points toward the target, revealing a muscular goblin armed with a club, standing guard in the tall grass as Chris and Hesta watch from their hiding spot. Hesta dashes forward with surprising speed, delivering a sharp blow to the goblin. However, the creature barely reacts, twitching slightly before letting out a sinister smirk, leaving Hesta wide-eyed in shock. The goblin lets out a roar and a mocking laugh, completely unfazed by Hesta's strike as it lunges forward with its club. From the tall grass, Rarf and Chris watch the scene unfold, their expressions turning grim as they realize the monster's strength. With a sudden and powerful strike, Rarf takes down the goblin, sending it crashing to the forest floor. As the monster lies lifeless, Hesta looks back at Chris and asks, "Creason, how is that?" Hesta looks at Chris with an eager expression, admitting that their approach might be a bit sloppy, but she asks him for confirmation if they are hunting the goblins properly. Chris ponders the coordination between his companions. He realizes that Hesta's role is to lure the goblins toward Rarf, who then delivers the final blow since he is unable to run. After witnessing their teamwork, Chris makes a decision and suggests that they form a party together. Hesta is absolutely thrilled, cheering with joy, while Rarf simply watches her enthusiastic reaction. Rarf skeptically asks why they should bother forming a party when they can already handle goblins just fine, prompting a frustrated reaction from Hesta. Suddenly, Rarf looms over Chris with an intense expression, questioning if he really wants to spend his entire life as a rookie adventurer. Intimidated by the sudden pressure, Chris quickly shouts that he was only joking. Rarf tells Chris that he is counting on him, and Chris reciprocates the feeling toward both Rarf and Hesta. However, Chris suddenly announces that he will head back first and suggests discussing the details of their party tonight. While Hesta and Rarf agree, Rarf is left slightly bewildered by Chris' abrupt departure. As Chris makes his exit, Rarf is left behind, shouting in disbelief that they aren't even hunting together despite having just formed a party. Hesta and Rarf return to where Chris is staying, greeting him energetically. To celebrate their new party, Rarf proudly presents some skewers they bought for him as a treat. Chris mentions that he also bought several things to mark the occasion of their new party. However, as he sets his items down, he clarifies that he didn't buy skewers. Rarf reacts with frustration, realizing they might have overbought, but Chris simply jokes that a few extra skewers wouldn't hurt. Chris and Hesta are left stunned, their expressions mirroring a shared moment of surprise. The source of the surprise is revealed to be a lavish spread of food. The feast includes pork buns from Seika Manju, sashimi from Marera, and seasoned rice from Maruha Diner. Hesta and Rarf are stunned by the spread of food. Hesta is speechless with excitement, while Rarf exclaims that these are all dishes from the famous restaurants they had always longed to try. Chris calmly assures them that they can eat everything, reminding them that they are now a party. Overwhelmed by the gesture, Hesta and Rarf look at him with admiration and gratitude. The three of them dive into the meal, with Rarf eating enthusiastically and Hesta laughing happily, while Chris looks on with a calm, slightly exhausted expression. With the feast finished and only empty plates remaining, Rarf turns to Chris and asks a serious question. What is his goal from here on out? Chris looks puzzled by the question, simply replying that making sure they can eat plenty should be enough of a goal. Rarf points out that Chris is already eating plenty as it is. He pushes further, asking if Chris has a clear purpose beyond the vague idea of being adventurers together. Leaving Chris to ponder the meaning of the word, Rarf reveals his own ambition, stating that he wants to become a mage and make money. While Chris tells him that a personal goal is perfectly fine, Hesta looks on with concern, fearing that Rarf will leave the party once he becomes successful. Rarf finds Hesta's question difficult to answer. Although he tells her that he doesn't plan on leaving the party, he is clearly flustered and confused by her insecurity, urging her to just spell out exactly what she is worried about. While the others spoke of simple desires, Chris' expression turns cold and determined. He clenches his fist, finally revealing the true purpose driving him forward: to get revenge on his younger brother. Chris adds that he wants to achieve his goal of revenge while staying with the party. Hesta is visibly shaken, questioning what he means, whilst Rarf asks more directly if Chris intends to kill his brother. Without hesitation, Chris gives a cold, simple answer. Yeah. Rarf is completely taken aback by Chris' murderous intent, shouting for him to handle it on his own. Both Rarf and Hesta are stunned, with Rarf struggling to comprehend how Chris can target his own flesh and blood. However, Chris remains cold and unwavering, admitting that he needs help to accomplish his goal. Chris coldly confirms that his brother is nearly the strongest person alive. Visibly shaken, Hesta asks for the reason why he wants to kill his own sibling. As the weight of the revelation sinks in, Rarf sets his mug down with a clatter, finally understanding why Chris was forced to flee to the forest. A flashback reveals a moment of terror where Chris narrowly escaped death by a stroke of luck. Returning to the present, Chris clenches his fist in anger, stating that he can never forgive Klaus and believes that if he is ever found, Klaus will certainly kill him. Ralph shares a piece of his own past, admitting that he once harbored a murderous hatred for his stepfather. Hesta agrees that such feelings toward family are understandable. However, Ralph quickly draws a line, stating firmly that he has no intention of helping Chris commit murder. Chris closes his eyes with a look of acceptance. He tells Ralph that it is fine, and that just having him understand his situation is enough. Ralph suddenly lashes out, accusing Chris of keeping dried grass as a poison intended for his brother. Chris calmly dismisses the claim, insisting it was merely something for him to eat. Internally, Chris reflects that he never believed he could poison the sword god, and even if he could, he wouldn't choose such a method. Still skeptical, Ralph demands to know exactly what the dried grass is. Chris remains composed, noting that the timing is perfect as he had planned to reveal the truth once they had formed a party. Chris reveals the secret of the dried grass, explaining that it is a poisonous herb capable of drawing out hidden abilities and gradually strengthening the body. While Ralph and Hesta are initially skeptical, Chris admits he is likely the only person to have uncovered its true power, leaving Ralph genuinely impressed. After hearing about the secret of the herb, Ralph turns to Chris and asks him what his goal is now. Chris turns the question back to Ralph, but Hesta first shares her own modest goal of becoming a mage to be useful to her companions. After Chris gives her his approval, Ralph bursts with enthusiasm, shouting his dream to become the strongest adventurer that everyone acknowledges. Chris closes his eyes with a gentle smile, softly remarking that such a bold and spirited goal is exactly what he expects from Ralph. Feeling embarrassed, Ralph shouts Chris not to make fun of him, while Hesta is captivated by Chris' rare smile. Chris calmly denies mocking him, and reveals that his own goal is actually the same as Ralph's, leaving the Ralph completely bewildered. Ralph notes that Chris seems to acknowledge his brother's skill, despite their mutual hatred. Chris describes Klaus as a once-in-several-centuries prodigy, who will soon be celebrated as a heroic champion. Intrigued and challenged by this revelation, Ralph decides that his goal of becoming the strongest now includes surpassing Chris' brother as well. Hesta firmly resolves to support both Chris and Ralph in their pursuit of revenge and strength. With a determined expression, Chris declares that the ultimate goal of their party is to surpass Klaus, the sword god, and asks if anyone has any objections. Ralph and Hesta respond instantly, and with conviction, declaring that they have absolutely no objections to the party's ultimate goal. The three of them share a moment of quiet reflection, smiling at the absurdity of their situations. Ralph is a holy knight who can barely walk. Hesta is a mage who cannot use magic, and Chris is a farmer who is immune to poison. Together, they form a party of misfits determined to defy the odds. With a clink of their mugs, the unlikely trio seals their bond, marking the official birth of the world's weakest party. With their new party officially formed, Hesta and Ralph head out into the forest. Hesta confidently boasts about their top-notch quality, eagerly asking Ralph for his opinion. Chris stands in the quiet of the woods, his expression calm and focused as he prepares to lead this unconventional party toward their ultimate goal. Ralph is completely blindsided, shouting in disbelief when Chris reveals he won't be joining them on quests for the time being. Chris remains composed, explaining that he has other priorities and noting that Ralph and Hesta are not yet prepared the difficulty of bronze rank quests. Frustrated by Chris' blunt assessment, Ralph shouts in disbelief, questioning the point of forming a party if they cannot even go on quests together. Chris clarifies the situation, stating that the first priority is either healing Ralph's injury or Hesta learning magic. Because of this, they agree to work separately until those goals are achieved. Calmly informs Ralph that he will go with him to see if there is any way to heal his leg. Ralph is completely caught off guard, stuttering in surprise and worrying that he cannot afford the money for a medical checkup. While reminding them that they still need to earn their own share, Chris generously offers to cover the cost of the medical checkup. Ralph is left speechless by the gesture. Ralph is visibly moved, thanking Chris with tears in his eyes. However, Chris dismisses the sentiment, telling him not to get weepy because it's gross. Ralph quickly snaps back, offended that his sincere gratitude is being called gross. As Ralph prepares to leave for his examination, he warns Chris about the difficulty of hunting goblins alone, and suggests they look into a monster called the stray cowbird. Chris agrees and tasks Hesta with finding the creature's location and weaknesses. Offering to pay her for the information, however, Hesta tells him that she doesn't need the money. Hesta points out that Chris is already covering the cost of Ralph's examination. In response, Chris decides that he will be the one to research the stray cowbird. Chris emphasizes the importance of keeping their finances clear to avoid future trouble. He proposes that lodging and meals remain split as they were, while work and earnings be divided equally 3 ways. Hesta agrees, deciding that she will accept payment properly. With the financial arrangements settled, Chris tells Hesta he is counting on her, as the scene opens up to reveal a grand and ornate building. After arriving at the clinic, Chris and Rarf are called in to see the doctor. Rarf asks the doctor to examine an old injury on his leg, which the doctor finds to be quite severe, causing Rarf to wince in pain as it is touched. Rarf explains that the severe injury on his leg occurred about 7 years ago. The doctor hums thoughtfully, carefully analyzing the old wound. The doctor delivers the grim diagnosis, explaining that Rarf's ligament is completely torn, and his meniscus is also damaged from years of neglect. Hearing this, Rarf asks with a concerned expression if it truly cannot be healed. Rarf is completely caught off guard, but the doctor looks at him with determination and declares that healing is possible. Rarf is stunned to learn that his leg can actually be healed. The doctor describes the detailed surgical process, which requires grafting a new ligament and using oil from a metal slime for the meniscus. While the doctor assures him of the possibility, he warns that the procedure costs a fortune and that Rarf must provide the metal slime oil himself. Hearing this, Rarf immediately asks about the cost. The doctor reveals the price of the procedure: 20 platinum coins. Rarf is absolutely stunned by the exorbitant amount, and Chris is equally shocked by the cost. Stunned by the exorbitant price, Chris asks if there is any other alternative. However, the doctor bluntly reminds him that the situation is severe because the injury was left untreated for far too long, and the leg was forced into use despite the damage. The doctor adds that a simple potion might have worked if the injury had been addressed early on. Rarf looks on with a hollow expression, overwhelmed by the reality of his condition. The doctor informs them that reconstruction surgery at the Healers Guild is already the most affordable option. Still concerned about the high cost, Chris asks if there is anywhere else that might be cheaper. A girl opens the door to the room where Rarf is lying in bed, calling out his name. She then turns to Chris, addressing him softly. Rin looks distressed, fearing that Rarf's leg might never be healed. Chris, however, remains calm and tells her that the situation is not hopeless. Chris informs Rin that while the guild can fix Raf's injury, it would cost 20 platinum coins. When Rin asks what happened, Chris simply remarks that is an idiot. The doctor then intervenes, mentioning that the healer recommended they look for someone named Blood, who might be able to help them. Following the doctor's lead, Chris and Rarf have managed to find information regarding this mysterious person named Blood. Chris reveals that Blood was once the best healer in the guild, but he left to pursue more profit as a wandering healer, charging insane prices for difficult cases. Rin is surprised by this, but Chris explains that as medicine advanced, Blood's skills became obsolete. Now, he lives in the back alleys of the capital, scraping by while treating the poor fate Chris considers to be karma. Chris notes that Rarf has started sulking after hearing that Blood is now a letdown. However, Chris realizes that if Blood has fallen that far, he might be willing to perform the surgery dirt cheap. Hesta sighs, feeling let down on Raf's behalf. Seeing this, Chris addresses her directly, explaining that this is precisely why he has come to her. Chris reveals that Blood is located in the capital, but he cannot risk going there himself for fear of encountering his brother. Knowing that Rarf is incapable of negotiating on his own, Chris asks Hesta to accompany him to the capital to speak with Blood, promising to cover all the travel expenses. Hesta agrees to the plan. The scene shifts to a view of the town's buildings under the starry night sky, as Hesta confidently declares that she will handle the task. Chris stands alone, watching from behind as Rarf and Hesta walk away through the city archway, heading toward the capital. A grand view of the capital city unfolds, with its towering cathedral and imposing architecture dominating the skyline. Chris examines his status screen, noting the significant increases in his stamina, strength, and endurance. After countless attempts, he has finally discovered which plants are capable of boosting his stats. With Rarf and Hesta gone to the capital, Chris sets his sights on the Banished forest. He intends to gather 2 specific types of poisonous plants, while hoping to discover new ones along the way. Chris recalls finding a plant with cute purple blossoms near the Flesh King in Banished forest. Although it looks innocent at first glance, the carcasses surrounding it reveal its true nature as a lethal baseline toxic plant that possesses the ability to boost stamina. Next, Chris describes a mushroom that appears poisonous at first sight, but it is actually used to boost endurance. Having already found plants for stamina and endurance, Chris reviews his status screen. Judging by his current growth, he is convinced that a plant to boost strength must also exist within Banished forest, and he sets his sights on finding it. Chris ventures deeper into the Banished forest, navigating through its dense groves and mysterious caves in search of the elusive plant. Observing that there are no signs of humans or monsters, Chris decides it is best to stay in his familiar surroundings for now. While he considers searching for a new base, He realizes there are still untouched plants nearby. With a determined gaze, he focuses his objective on gathering the 2 plants already proven to boost his stats. Chris assigns names to the 2 beneficial poisonous plants he found, designating them as raisin grass and genpei fungus. Chris carefully gathers the stat-boosting plants, making sure to leave some behind, and record their exact locations in his notebook. While he dreams of cultivating these rare plants himself, he realizes it's impossible while living in a dorm, and renting a field would be too risky given the nature of the poisonous flora. Sitting by his campfire in the forest, Chris carefully prepares the mushrooms he collected. As he works, he considers the only remaining solution to his cultivation, problem buying his own house but sighs, knowing it is far beyond his current reach. Chris considers the mounting costs of his journey, from expedition and appraisal fees, to Ralph's medical bills and Hestia's spellbook. Realizing that he also needs enough to buy a house, he sighs, acknowledging that everything ultimately depends on money. Looking up at the sky, Chris wishes there were a faster way to earn the money he desperately needs. With a sigh of relief, Chris finishes his task for the night. He has prepared a pot of genpei mushroom stew. Chris reflects on the taste of the genpei grass he added to his stew, noting that it tastes good enough, but he quickly realizes there is a problem. Chris turns his attention to the raisin grass. Recalling Hesta's advice, he prepares to swallow it wrapped in an oblatia new product on the market, designed to mask the taste. With a quick gulp, he manages to get it down without tasting a thing. Closing his eyes in relief, Chris is pleased that the plant went down without any taste. He notes that since the wrappers are cheap, he can now consume the medicine without any further suffering. Chris sighs in relief, noting that for the first time, he managed to eat poisonous plants without any suffering. As the scene shifts to a wide view of the landscape, it is revealed that this is his 5th day in Banished Forest. Chris looks over his gathered resources, noting that his harvests are going well, with plenty of raisin grass and genpei fungus. He has also found 20 new plants that could be poisonous, wondering if any of them might provide a boost to his strength. Just as Chris considers the potential of his new plants, he is suddenly interrupted. He freezes, his senses sharpening as he detects something unexpected in the darkness of the forest. As Chris remains alert, a mysterious figure emerges. This person reflects on their long history within the forest, admitting they once believed a certain rumor to be nothing more than a myth. Chris suddenly freezes, his attention drawn to a sharp sound echoing through the forest. He stands on high alert, sensing a presence nearby. A massive monster looms over the landscape, its body radiating a dangerous aura with flames flickering along its back, marking a sudden and terrifying escalation in the forest. Staring up at the menacing creature, Chris recognizes the beast. If he remembers correctly, this is Ducurus, the formidable lord of Banished Forest. Ducurus. Anything it sees is marked as prey, and once marked there is no escape. It is said to chase its prey to the ends of the earth. The beast's lethality is absolute, ripping through targets with razor-sharp claws and finishing them off with jaws strong enough to crush bone. Suddenly, the beast strikes. Ducurus lunges forward with devastating power, crashing into the earth and sending debris flying everywhere as it prepares for another onslaught. Panting heavily, Chris curses his misfortune. Everything had been going smoothly until the sudden appearance of the beast. Now facing the relentless Ducurus, he can only wonder how things went so horribly wrong. Pressing himself against the rough bark of a tree, Chris holds his breath in terror, knowing that he is barely concealed. Nearby, Ducurus continues its relentless search, its predatory gaze scanning the forest for its prey. Realizing that outrunning the beast is impossible, Chris decides he has no other choice but to take the initiative. Determined to fight back, he leaps into the canopy, preparing to strike first. With a swift movement, Chris leaps into the canopy, securing a vantage point high above. From his perch, he gazes down at Ducurus, his eyes sharp and determined as he prepares to strike. Seizing the perfect moment, Chris leaps from the branch and shouts, "Now!" as he plunges his sword down with all his might, creating a massive impact upon hitting his target. Chris lands his blow with precision, convinced that his positioning and the force of gravity have created a perfect attack. However, as the impact registers, a sudden doubt crosses his mind, realizing the strike might not have been as decisive as he hoped. The strike connects with a deafening impact, sending a massive shockwave through the air as Chris clashes head-on with the monstrous Ducurus. The collision erupts into a blinding explosion of force. Chris is thrown backward, letting out a cry of pain as the sheer power of the impact overwhelms him. The recoil of the impact sends Chris flying backward. He struggles to hold onto his weapon, his expression one of pure agony as he lets out a pained groan. Chris stares in disbelief, his eyes wide with shock. Despite his best effort, the massive Ducurus looms over him, radiating an overwhelming and menacing presence. Just as Chris reels from the shock, Ducurus prepares a devastating counterattack. gathering a brilliant light within its mouth to unleash a powerful blast. Just as Ducurus unleashes its devastating energy attack, Chris swings his sword to intercept it. The collision creates a blinding flash of light, and the overwhelming power of the blast forces Chris back. Amidst the violence of the clash, Chris hand brushes against a cluster of delicate, bell-shaped flowers, a sudden and quiet contrast to the intensity of the battle. As Ducurus looms over him with menacing intensity, Chris stares back with grim determination. He knows that if the Ryzen poison fails to work, this will be the end of his life. Suddenly, Ducurus lets out a deafening roar, its massive body trembling as the Ryzen poison finally begins to ravage its system. Ducurus writhes in pain, its massive body shaking from the effects of the poison. Seeing the Ducurus' distress, Chris realizes that the Ryzen poison is clearly working, yet he warns himself not to become conceited in the face of such a powerful foe. Seeing Ducurus immobilized, Chris recognizes a golden opportunity to end the fight. However, still reeling from the previous attack, he first drinks a healing potion to recover. With his strength returning, he prepares to deliver one final strike to finish the monster before it can retaliate. Now recovered and focused, Chris faces the struggling Ducurus, preparing himself for the decisive strike to end the battle. With a look of absolute determination, Chris dashes forward, swinging his blade in a decisive strike to end the battle. As Chris delivers his decisive blow, a pouch on his gear is ripped open, causing small objects to spill out. Ducurus lunges forward with a devastating strike, its massive claw sweeping across the battlefield. Chris faces the onslaught with a determined expression, while the torn pouch on his gear continues to spill its contents. Ducurus unleashes a devastating strike, smashing the earth with immense force and sending debris flying everywhere. With quick reflexes, Chris leaps back, narrowly evading the violent impact. A sudden bright impact strikes Ducurus, catching the beast off guard. With a cold and confident expression, Chris looks at the Ducurus and simply says, "Too bad." With a confident look, Chris reveals the truth behind his last move, admitting that the strike was only a feint to leave Ducurus completely vulnerable. With the distraction successful, Chris launches a powerful, explosive strike right into Ducurus' face, leaving the massive creature stunned by the sudden impact. As the impact registers, an object shatters into pieces. Chris watches with a sharp, determined gaze, the intensity of the battle still etched on his face. Chris stands his ground as the devastating force of his blow ripples through the Ducurus, leaving Ducurus shattered and stunned. The impact reaches its peak, causing Ducurus' body to explode into fragments. Chris stands calmly amidst the destruction as the massive creature is completely obliterated. Chris gasps for air, his chest heaving as the adrenaline begins to fade. He stands small and solitary amidst the towering trees, overwhelmed by the intensity of the battle he just concluded. The massive, shattered body of Ducurus lies motionless on the grass, completely defeated. In the distance, Chris stands alone in the silence of the forest, catching his breath after the intense battle. Panting heavily, Chris collapses to his knees beside the massive, broken carcass of Ducurus. He lets out a weary sigh, admitting to himself that for a moment he truly thought he was finished. A new chapter begins. In the heart of a town, Rarf and Rin stand together, with Rin focused on a piece of paper in her hands, perhaps searching for a destination or a clue. Chris opens the door and announces his return. Rin looks up with a smile, welcoming him home while Rarf watches on, calmly sipping from his mug. Rin suddenly stops, looking flustered and surprised, as she tells Chris to wait. Rin exclaims in worry, noting that Chris looks like a total mess. Covered in grime from his struggle, Chris explains that he was ambushed by a monster in the forest. He admits that while he managed to kill it, the situation could have turned dire if another enemy had appeared, which is why he rushed back immediately without even washing up. Ren frantically asks Chris if he is hurt, her face filled with worry. Chris calmly reassures her, explaining that while his body is sore from taking a few hits, he has no serious injuries. However, Rarf is left shaken. He realizes that if Chris describes the creature as a monster, it must have been truly terrifying, making him wonder if they can ever return to that forest again. Chris calmly states that he made sure the monster was dead, and that he plans to head back to the forest again. This sudden declaration leaves Rarf and Rin stunned, unable to believe he would return to such a dangerous place so quickly. Rarf shouts a desperate warning, telling Chris not to dare die on them. Chris calmly responds, stating he has no intention of dying so easily since they are now a party. Suddenly, the mood shifts as Rin notices that Chris brought skewers, leaving Rarf completely bewildered. Chris hands over the skewers, simply telling them to eat. As he does, Rarf looks at him and thinks that although Chris can be a hassle sometimes, he is honestly quite easy to deal with. Chris asks Hestia how things went on her end. Hestia confirms that she found and met with Brad, a man living in the black market who is struggling financially. She explains that while he initially tried to negotiate a price of 15 platinum coins, She stood her ground until he eventually begged to do the job for only 5. Chris is shocked to hear the fee was lowered to 5 platinum coins, noting that it's an amount they can actually afford. However, Hesta looks concerned, admitting that even 5 platinum coins still seems incredibly expensive to her, and questioning if it's truly all right. Crix points toward Hesta, reassuring her that the expense is worth it, as treating her leg was the very reason they formed their party in the first place. Chris looks at Hesta with absolute resolve and makes a bold promise. No matter what happens, he will ensure she learns magic. Hesta is completely taken aback, her eyes sparkling as she is overwhelmed by the possibility of achieving something she likely thought was impossible. Overwhelmed by Chris' resolve to help her learn magic, Hesta bows deeply and thanks him with tears of joy. Chris, looking slightly embarrassed by her intense reaction, simply responds with a quiet yes. Chris brings up another matter, suggesting that Hesta stop using honorifics so they can treat each other as equals, given that they are the same age. After a brief silence, Hesta bluntly refuses, stating that she would like to keep using them. Chris gives in to Hesta's preference, smiling as he tells her that he doesn't mind if she continues to use honorifics. While eating, Dane curiously asks Chris about his recent activities, doubting that killing a single monster was his only achievement. Chris calmly responds that he actually got plenty out of the experience, mentioning that the ambush happened right as he was about to go home. Dane looks at the large sacks Chris has brought back, questioning if all of it is poison. Chris simply confirms it with a short, nonchalant response. Dane looks at Chris with a sense of awe, admitting that Chris is already far ahead of them and continues to grow every day. Chris remains pragmatic, explaining that he must get stronger to earn the money needed to help his friends, telling Dane to simply be glad about it. Dane quietly acknowledges the truth in Chris' words. The view shifts to the rooftops of the buildings under a somber, cloudy sky, while a voice continues the conversation, softly admitting that it's just a feeling. The scene transitions to a wide shot of a desolate mountainous landscape. Chris is seen trekking through the rocky terrain alone. As he reaches a certain point, he stops and looks around, noting that this looks like the place he was searching for. Chris looks at a flyer depicting a winged creature, identifying his target as the stray cowbird. With a determined expression, he declares that starting today, he is back to adventuring. Chris considers the information provided by Hesta. While the wide eastern plains are known as prime hunting grounds, the high competition and low monster numbers make them less ideal. Instead, Hesta recommended a secluded area past the abandoned Northwest Road, where few hunters venture and information is scarce. But the potential for success is higher. Chris reaches the desolate area past the abandoned Northwest Road, gazing out at the sharp peaks of the mountains as he prepares for his hunt. Chris finds his target, the stray cowbird, grazing peacefully in the rugged terrain. As he watches from the shadows, the creature suddenly becomes alert, sensing his presence. The massive stray cowbird looms large in the rocky landscape, its powerful presence filling the frame. Watching from the shadows, Chris confirms that the creature matches the description of a stray cowbird perfectly. He recalls that although they possess wings, they are flightless and rely on powerful jumps to move, while also noting that their meat is sold as food. Chris continues his analysis, noting that underestimating the creature could lead to being flattened by a body slam, while playing too cautiously might leave one vulnerable to its horn charges. He considers the standard strategies for dealing with the beast, utilizing long-range attacks to stay out of reach, or engaging in closer-range combat by dodging its powerful slams. Having weighed the risks and strategies, Chris finally reveals himself, sword in hand, facing the massive stray cowbird in the rugged terrain. With a sharp motion, Chris draws his blade and lunges forward, striking at the stray cowbird with speed and precision. With a sudden burst of speed, Chris lunges forward, his blade cutting through the air as he strikes the massive stray cowbird. With a decisive blow, Chris strikes the stray cowbird with full force. The monster reels from the impact, letting out a loud, agonized cry as it is overwhelmed by the attack. The impact is devastating, knocking the stray cowbird back with immense power as Chris stands his ground. With the fight concluded, Chris focuses on the harvest. He knows that the way a monster is killed greatly affects its market value. Following the optimal method, he ensures the stray cowbird is knocked out, bled, and its guts removed cleanly before burying the remains. Now, it's time to carry the remains back. Chris notes that the request only asked for the fillet and flank, so he decides to butcher the creature right here to minimize the load he'll have to carry. The scene transitions to a grand city square under a starry night sky. Leon, Lyra, and Rumi stand among a group of people near a large fountain, as hushed whispers fill the air and a welcoming voice greets an arrival. A muscular man in an apron greets the group, apologizing for the mess, and pointing them toward the entrance of the eatery. Suddenly, Chris appears at the entrance, bringing the massive carcass of the stray cowbird with him. The sight of the giant monster's head right in their faces causes immediate panic and shock. Chris calmly explains that he decided it would be wasteful to cut it up, so he brought the whole thing, identifying himself as the adventurer who completed the request. Jin stares in utter shock, sweating as he asks if this young man is truly the one who took the request, while Chris calmly walks forward with the enormous monster draped across his back. Jin examines the massive carcass, marveling at its size and the professional way it was handled. He notes that the bleeding and gutting were done perfectly, keeping the meat fresh, and admits that this might be the best stray cowbird they've ever had. Chris responds with a curious "really?" Jins looks on with a thoughtful expression, admitting that hardly anyone ever brings back the whole monster. Chris asks if he can expect a high price for the carcass. Jin confirms that he can, but explains that he needs to cut it up and appraise it first. As he prepares to do so, Jin calls out to the name Nathaniel. Chris expresses doubt, stating he won't be paying, but Jin reassures him that the meal is on the house as a reward for his hard work. Jin then turns to Nathaniel, ordering him to get Chris something to clean up with and to grill some meat for him. Jin informs Chris that he will be called once the butchering and appraisal are complete, telling him to eat in the meantime. As Chris enters the building, he thinks to himself about the free food and the reward of 5 gold coins. As Jin takes the carcass away, Chris thinks about the payment. The request listing had originally stated a maximum of 3 gold coins, but because the specimen was whole, well-prepared, and massive, they decided to up the price. Looking out over the town under the starry night sky, Chris reflects on the efficiency of his work. He notes that while a typical bronze quest only pays 4 silver coins and can take an entire day, this particular job has netted him far more than he bargained for. He feels optimistic that at this rate, he will be able to save up a significant amount of money in no time. Chris returns, once again covered in blood from his battle. Rin greets him with a warm welcome back, while Dane looks on, noting his blood-stained appearance. A month has passed since Chris began hunting stray cowbirds. Though the monsters are rare and difficult to track, the financial reward is substantial. As Dane hands over his share of the profits, Chris notes that he has managed to pull in 26 gold coins, a sum far superior to what he would earn from typical quests. And with that money, Hestia. Chris reveals a mysterious old book, adorned with a diamond emblem and flam-like patterns. Hesta is stunned by the sight of it, while Dane looks on with a confused expression, questioning why Chris has such a ratty old book. Hesta is completely stunned, her eyes widening in disbelief as she realizes what the old book actually is. "Ayat," she exclaims, overwhelmed by the discovery. Chris calmly explains that he bought the grimoire using the money he had saved up. He warns the two Hestas that if they continue to scrape by with mere goblin hunts, it will eventually affect him too. Hesta looks toward Chris and softly calls his name, seemingly touched or overwhelmed by his unexpected gesture. Overwhelmed with emotion, Hesta begins to cry, thanking Chris from the bottom of her heart. She tells him that he doesn't just look after them, but even goes as far as buying them things. Chris reacts modestly to Hesta's tears, telling her not to thank him. He encourages her to use the grimoire to learn magic, so she can finally pull her own weight in the party. Overwhelmed with emotion, Hesta continues to express her heartfelt gratitude. Hesta clutches the grimoire tightly to her chest, her face flushing with resolve as she vows to master magic no matter what. Watching her, Chris reflects on how much she has changed since the beginning. Rarf asks what a grimoire actually is, and Chris explains that it is simply a book that allows one to learn magic, noting that while he hasn't read this specific one, it is likely full of magic theory. Upon realizing that this means Hesta can actually learn magic, Rarf becomes incredibly excited. Chris asks, "See?" As he shows Hesta something, though initially confused, Hesta looks up at him with a blushing, happy expression, deeply moved by his kindness. Rarf falls into a pensive silence, suddenly struck by a worrying thought. He wonders aloud that if Hesta learns magic, he might end up as the only dead weight remaining in the group. Noticing his distress, Chris asks what's wrong, to which Rarf honestly admits that the prospect actually scares him. Chris gives Rarf a dry look, teasingly reminding him that Hes always been dead. Wait, the only difference being that Hes now vocal about it. Defeated by the truth, Rarf can only concede that it's a fair point. Chris tells Hesta to prioritize learning magic, explaining that it's the key to taking on bronze-ranked quests and finally making some money. Rarf, visibly shaken by the realization, gulps before determinedly agreeing. A close-up of the grimoire's pages reveals mysterious, ancient text. Chris explains the first essential rule of magic to Hesta. Before she can cast any spell, she must first learn how to control her mana. Chris explains the visualization technique, telling Hesta to imagine a river flowing through her body and to practice altering its speed. After Chris concludes the explanation, Rarf comments on the water circulation method, and Hesta closes her eyes, determined to try it out. Rarf contemplates whether he can master the technique just by copying it. Meanwhile, Chris, feeling absolutely nothing from the exercise, finds himself growing sleepy. Rarf looks over at Hesta, curiously asking her how the exercise is going. Just as Rarf asks about her progress, Hesta suddenly begins to float, enveloped in a brilliant swirling aura of mana. Both Chris and Rarf watch in utter shock at her unexpected and immediate success. Chris and Rarf are completely bewildered by the sight of Hesta floating. While Rarf exclaims in disbelief at the phenomenon, Chris hurriedly asks if she is all right. Hesta, looking equally surprised by her own power, calmly responds that she is fine. Looking at the swirling energy around her hand, Hesta realizes that this is the mana Chris mentioned. With a small smile, she feels she might finally be getting the hang of it. Chris warns Hesta not to blow the place apart, but she reassures him that it's only mana control and not actual magic. While Chris is surprised by how quickly she is mastering the technique, a sudden, violent burst of energy erupts around her, prompting Rarf to shout that it doesn't look safe from where Hes standing. The mana surrounding Hesta grows even more volatile, intensifying by the second as the situation becomes increasingly unstable. Hesta catches her breath and decides to stop her practice for now. Watching her, Chris realizes that she is likely the one who was granted the mage class during the Rite of Revelation. The focus shifts to a guide on mana manipulation, emphasizing that visualization is the key. The instructions suggest lighting a candle and observing the flame as a way to practice turning mana into fire. Chris shows Hesta the instructions from the book, confirming that this is the training she needs. Hesta looks at the candle's flame and decides to try the visualization process immediately. Chris asks Rarf why he is tagging along with them. Rarf simply admits that he has nothing better to do, which Chris finds fair enough. However, as Chris continues to probe, Rarf seems to hesitate and become flustered. While waiting for Hesta to finish her training, Chris suggests teaching Rarf the basics of sword fighting. Rarf is taken aback but clearly excited by the offer. Rarf is visibly thrilled, admitting that he has never had proper sword training, and that Chris' offer means a lot to him. Chris, while admitting he dislikes being outmatched, tells Rarf that he cannot ignore his development, confirming his commitment to teach him. Filled with eagerness, Rarf clenches his fist and passionately begs Chris for instruction, calling him master with absolute devotion. Rarf and several others throw themselves at Chris' feet, fervently begging him to be their master and teach them. Despite their enthusiasm, Chris is visibly uncomfortable, telling them that being called master makes his skin crawl, leading them to remark on how harsh he is. Chris puts Rarf's eagerness to the test, engaging him in a sparring session. With precise movements, Chris effortlessly blocks Rarf's strikes and quickly overpowers him, leaving Rarf stunned by the gap in their abilities. Rarf winces in pain, completely overwhelmed by Chris' superior strength as he catches his breath. Chris analyzes his performance, concluding that while Rarf's movements are smooth, his fundamentals are lacking. Knowing that Rarf is a holy knight, Chris decides to drill the basics into him, confident that once the foundation is set, Rarf will grow stronger at a rapid pace. Rarf lies completely worn out on the ground, following the intense training session. Suddenly, a voice calls out to Chris, causing him to turn around to see who is approaching. Rarf enthusiastically praises Hesta after she successfully lights a small fire on her fingertip. While Hesta beams with pride, Chris watches in disbelief, questioning if she is naturally gifted or if magic is simply that easy to pick up, as it took her less than 30 minutes to succeed. Eager to advance, Hesta asks Chris if she can move on to proper spellcasting already. Chris, consulting his book, tells her that the next step is to practice shooting the flame she manifested. Hesta confidently claims she has already grasped the feel of the magic, prompting Chris to ask if she intends to skip the basics. He agrees to let her proceed as she wishes. Looking at both Hesta and Rarf, Chris internally vows to help them both reach their full potential, but he also reminds himself that his own pride demands he push himself even harder to stay ahead. Chris settles into a demanding routine, spending his days hunting stray cowbirds and his nights dedicated to helping Hesta master her magic and drilling the fundamentals of swordsmanship into Rarf. Weeks pass by just like that, with Chris remaining dedicated to his daily cycle of hunting and mentoring Hesta and Rarf. The results of the training are staggering. Hesta has mastered all the elemental basics, including the fireball spell with abnormal speed. Rarf's growth has been just as insane in their one-on spars. He has already managed to beat Chris 50 times. As for himself, Chris reveals that he hasn't been idle. He has finally tracked down a plant capable of boosting strength, which he names the Lizaf fruit. Chris asks Hesta if she is heading out to practice her magic again. Hesta eagerly agrees and asks Chris to join her, and he readily consents. However, Rarf interrupts the two, announcing that he has a proposal for both of them. Rarf suggests that they do an ability appraisal to see how much they have grown. Chris explains that an ability appraisal is a ritual that turns one's stats into numbers, much like the rite of revelation. While Rarf is surprised that such a service even exists, Chris quickly clarifies that it isn't free, prompting a shocked reaction from Rarf regarding the cost. Chris bluntly states the price. 1 gold coin. Rarf can only stare in disbelief, utterly shocked by the steep cost. Rarf reacts with absolute shock, shouting in disbelief that anyone would pay a gold coin just to see their stats. Chris calmly clarifies that while the ritual doesn't increase strength, it tells you exactly where you stand. When Chris turns to Hesta for confirmation, she hesitantly agrees that 1 gold coin is simply too much for such a service. Chris insists that the appraisal isn't pointless, explaining that knowing exactly how much they grow from a day's training would make them far more efficient. He even offers to cover the cost for them, but Rarf politely declines. Rarf enthusiastically argues that a single gold coin could allow him to eat like a king for 10 days, making it far more appealing than the appraisal. Chris looks on with a deadpan expression, remarking that he won't waste a gold coin just to satisfy Ralph's appetite. Chris tells Rarf that while he won't force him, he won't be handing over any coins if Rarf skips the appraisal. Hesta quickly agrees to go through with it if Chris is paying. Realizing he can get the appraisal without spending his own money, Rarf begins to reconsider. Rarf is left completely bewildered, barely able to process the situation. Meanwhile, Hesta is already ready to go, and Chris tells them both that they should head out immediately before the church closes. Rarf suddenly shouts out, realizing that if the appraisal is free for him, he definitely wants in. Upon arriving at the church, Chris and his companions are greeted by Graham. Surprised to see the group, Graham asks if Chris isn't alone today, to which Chris confirms that he wants his party members to be appraised as well. Graham agrees to the request and asks the group to hand over their adventurer cards and 2 gold coins. Once the process is complete, Chris asks Hesta if her stats were displayed correctly, and she confirms that she saw all of them. Ralph looks at his card with a puzzled expression, questioning if the results are accurate, because his stats seem lower than he had hoped. Meanwhile, Hesta comments on how surprisingly detailed the appraisal information is. Rarf looks hesitant and asks Chris not to laugh at his results. Chris calmly agrees and asks to see the card. Upon looking, it is revealed that Rarf possesses the prestigious Holy Knight class, along with the special skill Divine Blessing and the normal skill Roar of the Guardian Paladin. Rarf looks at Chris expectantly, asking for his reaction. Staring at the adventurer card in shock, Chris admits to himself that while he had a feeling, Rarf is incredibly strong. Chris looks at Rarf and thinks about his hidden potential. He realizes that Rarf's apparent lack of stamina and agility is merely a result of a leg injury. Amazed that Rarf is already so strong despite only hunting goblins, Chris concludes that his stats will soar once he begins fighting more powerful monsters. Chris notes that it's no surprise Rarf is so strong, as Holy Knights are naturally powerful. He adds that if Rarf's leg injury heals, he might even outmatch Chris himself, which leaves Rarf completely stunned. Rarf looks at his card in disbelief, wondering if his numbers are actually high, since he previously believed a strength of 10 was weak. Chris admits he isn't sure about the standards as he's only seen his own stats. Then Hesta's status is revealed, showing she is a mage with a staggering magic stat of 41, though her physical abilities are quite low. Looking at the card, Chris notes that Hesta's magic stat is completely off the charts. Hesta sighs in relief, admitting that she'd be useless as a mage if her stats weren't that high. Chris notices the Mana Surge skill on Hesta's card and asks if she received it during the Rite of Revelation, as she had never mentioned it before. Hesta looks puzzled, admitting that she was never told about such a skill during the ceremony, and wonders if the priest simply forgot to mention it. Recalling his own past, Chris remembers how he was told he had a tragic fate during his Rite of Revelation, which actually turned out to be his poison resistance. He muses that these abilities might be innate, rather than granted by the rite itself. Chris informs Rarf that his stats are actually higher than his own, leaving Rarf in complete disbelief. After realizing he might even be stronger than Hesta, Rarf insists that Chris show his own stats since he has already seen theirs. Chris eventually agrees to the request. Chris shows his appraisal results. His card reveals his class as a farmer, with low base stats but notable bonuses, and his unique special skill, poison resistance. Rarf is puzzled by the split numbers on Chris' appraisal card, and asks for an explanation. Chris clarifies that the left number represents his base stats, while the right is a boost from an external source. Upon learning that Chris eats specific plants every day to raise his stats, an excited Rarf demands that he share them. However, Chris quickly reminds him that the plants are... Rarf reacts with disgust to the idea of eating poison. Chris bluntly tells him he's welcome to join in if he doesn't mind dying. Stunned, Rarf realizes that the dried grass he had encountered actually possessed such a powerful and dangerous effect. Chris tells Rarf that being blessed as a holy knight is far more unfair than anything else. Determined, Rarf declares that it doesn't matter, and that he will train hard to grow stronger. Chris gives a small, approving chuckle as they stand before the grand church. The group gathers outside, ready for a new challenge. Chris asks Rarf if he has everything he needs, and Rarf confidently confirms he is ready. Today is a significant step forward for them as they take on their first bronze-ranked quest, finally moving beyond hunting simple goblins. The details of the quest are revealed. Their target is a swarm of loud frogs plaguing the southern farmlands, and someone mentions they will be tagging along for this mission. Chris examines the details of their target, the loud frogs. These giant amphibians attack with powerful jumps and possess toxic, mucus-covered skin that can cause numbness upon contact. While they are weak individually, Chris notes that they become dangerous when in swarms, making them a fitting target for a bronze-ranked quest. As they prepare to move out, Rarf outlines the strategy, assigning Hesta to handle enemies at a distance while he takes charge of those that get close. Chris agrees with the plan and the trio sets off together, ensuring everyone is on the same page. Rarf looks uneasy, questioning if their simple plan will actually work, and admitting that voicing it makes him nervous. Chris doesn't offer words of comfort instead. He delivers a sharp flick to Rarf's forehead with a loud crack, leaving Rarf groaning in pain. Chris tells Rarf to relax and get moving, confident in their success. Rarf, still rubbing his forehead, laments that Chris doesn't understand how scared they are. Chris simply shuts him down, telling him to quit whining. A brief look back reveals the hard work the group put in. Hesta quickly mastered not only ball spells but arrow spells as well, while Rarf's swordsmanship improved significantly through daily training, because Hesta wanted to perfect her arrows before advancing. They had stuck to hunting goblins until this moment. Chris reflects on the growth of his companions, noting that both Rarf and Hesta are now capable enough to face bronze-ranked monsters. With himself acting as their backup, he believes there is no real danger for them today. As they begin their quest, the group comes face-to-face with the giant loud frogs. Rarf is slightly taken aback, noting that they are finally fighting something other than humanoid goblins. Chris remains focused, instructing Hesta to maintain her distance and land her shots exactly as they had practiced.